Journey to the Center of the Earth by Jules Verne. On the 24th of May, 1863, a Sunday, my uncle, Professor Lidenbrock, came rushing back towards his little house at number 19 Königstrasse, one of the oldest streets in the historic part of Hamburg. Martha the maid must have thought she was running very late, for dinner had hardly begun to simmer on the kitchen range. I said to myself, if my uncle is hungry, he'll shout out his annoyance, for he is the most impatient of men. "Professor Lidenbrock here already?" Martha exclaimed in amazement, slightly opening the dining-room door. "Yes, indeed. But dinner has every right not to be cooked, for it's not 2 o'clock yet. It's only just struck the half-hour on St. Michael's." "Then why has Professor Lidenbrock come back?" "Presumably he will tell us." "Oh, here he is. I'm off, Master Axel. You will make him see reason, won't you?" And the good Martha disappeared back into her culinary laboratory. I remained alone, but to make the worst-tempered of professors see reason did not seem possible, given my slightly indecisive character. So I was getting ready for a prudent retreat to my little bedroom at the top of the house, when the front door groaned on its hinges. Large feet made the wooden staircase creak, and the master of the house came through the dining-room and burst into his study. On his hurried way through, though, he had thrown his nutcracker-head cane in the corner, his broad hat brushed up the wrong way on the table, and the ringing words to his nephew, "Axel, I'm here." Otto Lidenbrock was not a bad man, I will gladly concede, but unless changes happen to him, which is highly unlikely, he will die a terrible eccentric. He was a professor at the Johanneum, and gave a course on mineralogy, during which he normally got angry at least once or twice. Not that he was worried whether his students were assiduous at his lectures, or whether they paid attention, or whether they were successful later. He hardly bothered about these details. He lectured subjectively, to use the expression from German philosophy, for himself, and not for others. He was a learned egoist, and a selfish scholar, a well of science whose handle groaned whenever someone wanted to draw something out of it. In a word, a miser. In Germany there are 1 or 2 professors like this. But despite all this, my uncle was an authentic scholar. I cannot emphasize this too much. Although he sometimes broke his samples by handling them too roughly, he combined the geologist's talent with a mineralogist's eye. With his mallet, his steel spike, his magnetic needle, his blow lamp, and his flask of nitric acid, he was highly gifted. From the fracture, appearance, resistance, melting point, sound, smell, and taste of any given mineral, he could put it without hesitation into any one of the 600 classifications recognized by modern science. Such was the character calling for me so impatiently. Imagine a tall, thin man, with an iron constitution and youthful blonde hair that made him look a good 10 years younger than his 50. His big eyes darted incessantly around behind imposing glasses. His nose, long and thin, was like a sharpened blade. Unkind people even claimed it was magnetized and picked up iron filings. Absolute slander. It only picked up snuff, but in rather large quantities, to tell the truth. If I add that my uncle took mathematical strides of exactly 3 feet, and that while walking he firmly clenched his fists, the sign of an impetuous temperament, then you will know him well enough not to wish to spend too much time in his company. My uncle was not poor, not for a German professor. The house was entirely his, both building and contents. The latter consisted of his goddaughter, Gräuben, a 17-year-old girl from Virland, and Martha and myself. In my dual capacity as nephew and orphan, I had become the laboratory assistant for his experiments. With such an eccentric, the only thing to do was to obey. I accordingly hurried into his study. My uncle was buried in his large armchair covered with Utrecht velvet, holding a tome in both hands and studying it with the deepest admiration. "What a book! What a book!" he kept saying. "And what's the title of this marvellous volume?" I asked with too eager an enthusiasm to be genuine. "This work," replied my uncle, getting excited, "is the Heimskringla of Snorre Tullsen, the famous 12th century Icelandic author. It is the chronicle of the Norwegian princes who ruled over Iceland." "Really?" I exclaimed as well as I could. It's presumably a German translation.
What?
The professor replied animatedly.
A translation? What would I be doing with a translation? Who's bothered about your translation? This is the original work in Icelandic. That magnificent language, both simple and rich, containing the most diverse grammatical combinations, as well as numerous variations in the words.
Like German, I slipped in fortuitously.
Yes, replied my uncle, shrugging his shoulders. Not to mention that Icelandic has 3 genders, like Greek, and declensions of proper nouns, like Latin.
Ah, I said, my indifference a little shaken. And are the characters in this book handsome?
Characters? Who's speaking of characters, benighted Axel? You did say characters, did you not? Oh, so you are taking this for a printed book. Ignoramus, this is a manuscript, and a runic manuscript at that.
Runic?
Yes. Are you now going to ask me to explain this word as well?
There is certainly no need, I replied in the tone of a man wounded in his pride. But my uncle continued all the more, and told me things despite my opposition that I wasn't specially interested in knowing.
Runes, he said, were handwritten characters formerly used in Iceland, and, according to the tradition, were invented by Odin himself. But look, irreverent boy, admire these forms which sprang from a god's imagination.
I swear that, having no other reply to give, I was going to prostrate myself, the sort of response that necessarily pleases gods and kings, because it has the advantage of never embarrassing them, when an incident happened to set the course of the conversation off on a different path. This was the appearance of a filthy parchment which slid out of a book and fell to earth. My uncle rushed to pick up this scrap with an eagerness easy to understand. An old document locked up in an old book since time immemorial could not fail to have a considerable value in his eyes.
"But what is this?" he exclaimed.
At the same time he carefully spread the parchment out on his desk. It was 5 inches long and 3 inches wide, with horizontal lines of mumbo-jumbo style characters written on it.
"It's quite obviously runic," said the professor, knitting his brows. "This is what we call a cipher, in which the meaning is hidden in letters which have deliberately been mixed up, and which, if properly laid out, would form an intelligible sentence."
For my part, I thought there was absolutely nothing here, but kept my opinions carefully to myself. The professor then took the book and the parchment and compared them with each other.
"The 2 documents are not in the same hand. The cipher is posterior to the book, for I can see an immediate and irrefutable proof. The first letter is a double M. That would be sought in vain in Turleson's book, for it was added to the Icelandic alphabet only in the 14th century, so therefore at least 200 years elapsed between the manuscript and the document."
That, I must admit, seemed quite logical.
"I am therefore led to think," said my uncle, "that one of the owners of the book must have written out the mysterious characters. But who the devil was this owner? Might he not have inserted his name at some point in the manuscript?"
My uncle lifted his glasses up, took a strong magnifying glass, and carefully worked his way over the first few pages of the book. On the back of the second one, the half-title page, he discovered a sort of stain, which to the naked eye looked like an ink blot. However, looking closer, it was possible to distinguish a few half-erased characters. My uncle realized that this was the interesting part, so he concentrated on the blemish, and with the help of his big magnifying glass he ended up distinguishing the following symbols, runic characters, which he spelled out without hesitation.
"Arne Saknussemm!"
he cried in a triumphant voice.
"But that is a name to conjure with, and an Icelandic one at that. The name of a scholar of the 16th century, a celebrated alchemist."
I looked at my uncle with a certain admiration. "Perhaps it is," I dared reply. "But what would be the point of a scholar hiding a marvellous discovery in such a way?"
Why? How should I know? Galileo, did he not act in this way for Saturn? In any case, we shall soon see. I shall have the secret of this document, and will neither eat nor sleep until I have discovered it. This Saknussemm was an educated man. It seems certain to me that the original sentence must have been written normally, then jumbled up following a rule which we have yet to discover. The person who got access to the key of the cipher would be able to read it fluently. But what is this key? Axel, do you have the key? To this question I replied nothing, and for a good reason. I was gazing at a charming portrait on the wall, one of Gräuben. My uncle's ward was then in Altona, staying at one of her relatives. Her absence made me very sad because I can admit it now. The pretty little Verland girl and the professor's nephew loved each other, with all Germanic patience and calm. We had got engaged without my uncle knowing. He was too much of a geologist to understand such feelings. Gräuben was a charming girl, blonde with blue eyes, of a slightly serious character, but she did not love me any the less for all that. For my part, I adored her, if, that is, the word exists in the Teutonic language. As a result of this, the picture of my little Verland girl immediately switched me from the world of reality to that of daydreams, that of memories. It was at this point in my daydream when my uncle, hitting the table with his fist, brought me violently back to reality. "Let's see," he said. "In order to mix up the letters of a sentence, it seems to me that the first idea to come into one's mind ought to be to write the words vertically instead of horizontally." Just before performing his critical experiment, Professor Lidenbrock's eyes were throwing sparks out through his glasses. His hands trembled as he picked the old parchment up again. He was profoundly excited. Finally, he coughed loudly, and in a solemn voice, calling out successively the first letter of each word, then the second, he read out a series of letters that were to my ears utterly meaningless. Suddenly, a violent blow from his fist shook the table. Ink spurted. The pen jumped from my hands. "That's not it!" shouted my uncle. "It makes no sense!" Then crossing the study like a cannonball and going down the stairs like an avalanche, he threw himself into the Königstrasse and shot off at a rate of knots. Alone again, I thought of going to tell Gräuben everything. But how could I get out of the house? The professor might come back at any moment. What if he summonsed me? Or if he wanted to start work again on that word puzzle which even old Oedipus couldn't have solved? And if I wasn't there when he called for me, what might happen then? Would he come back triumphant or discouraged? Who would win, him or the secret? I was wondering about such matters, and without thinking picked up the parchment with its incomprehensible series of letters, 132 in total. I tried to group the letters into words. I couldn't. Whether you put them into 2s, 3s, 5s, 6s, nothing came out that made sense. The 14th, 15th, and 16th letters did produce the English word ice. The 84th, 85th, and 86th ones gave sir. In the middle of the document, in the third line, I spotted the Latin words rota, mutabile, ira, nec, and atra. It's amazing. These last few words seem to confirm my uncle's view about the language of the document. I can even see luco, which means sacred wood. It's true that the third line also includes tabiled. That sounds completely Hebrew to me. And the last one, mer, arc, and mer, pure and unadulterated French. It was enough to drive you out of your mind. 4 different languages in the same preposterous sentence. What possible connection could there be between ice, sir, anger, cruel, sacred wood, changeable, mother, bow, and sea? Only the first and last were easily linked. In a document written in Iceland, it was hardly surprising that there should be a sea of ice. But putting the rest of the puzzle back together was another matter entirely. I was struggling with an insoluble problem. My brain started overheating, my eyes blinking at the sheet. The 132 letters seemed to dance around me, like those silver drops which float above your head when there is a sudden rush of blood to it. I was having a sort of hallucination. I was suffocating. I needed some fresh air. Absent-mindedly, I fanned myself with the piece of paper, with the back and the front passing alternately before my eyes. Imagine my surprise when I thought I caught sight of perfectly intelligible words during a quick turn of the sheet, just as the other side came into view. Latin words, like criterum and terrestri. Suddenly my mind sparked. Through the fleeting glimpses I had caught sight of the truth. I had discovered how the code worked. You can imagine how excited I felt. My eyes went out of focus and I couldn't see anything. I spread the piece of paper out on the table. All I had to do now to possess the secret was to glance at it. I bent over the table. I placed my finger on each successive letter and without stopping, without slowing down at all, read the whole message out loud.
What amazement. What terror entered my soul. First, it was like being hit by a blow you didn't expect. What? Had the things I had just discovered really happened? A man had been daring enough to penetrate... No, I cried indignantly. No, I'm not going to tell my uncle. It would be terrible if he got to know about such a journey. He'd just want to have a go himself. Nothing would stop a geologist of such determination. He would leave anyway, against all obstacles, whatever the cost. And he'd take me with him. And we wouldn't come back. Never. I cried out loud, and since I am able to prevent any such idea crossing the mind of the dictator who governs my life, I will do so. By turning this document in every direction he might accidentally discover the code, I'm going to destroy it. The fire hadn't quite gone out. I picked up the parchment. My trembling hand was just about to throw the whole lot onto the coals and thus destroy the dangerous secret when the study door opened. My uncle came in. I had barely had time to put the wretched document back on the desk. Professor Lidenbrock seemed preoccupied. His obsessive idea clearly hadn't given him a moment's rest. He had obviously pondered the question during his walk, considered it, called on every resource of his imagination, and he had plainly come back to try out some new combination. Sure enough, he sat down in his armchair and, pen in hand, began to write out formulae that looked like algebraic calculations. For 3 long hours my uncle worked without a word, without looking up, rubbing out, starting again, crossing out, setting to for the umpteenth time. I knew full well that if he managed to put the letters into every single order possible, then the right sentence would come out. But I also knew that a mere 20 letters can form 2,432,902,008,176,640,000 combinations. In fact, there were 132 letters in the sentence, and these 132 letters produced a total number of sentences that had at least 133 digits. One that is virtually impossible to enumerate, and goes completely beyond the bounds of imagination. I therefore felt reassured about the heroic way of solving the problem. But time passed. Night came. The street noises died down. My uncle, still bent over his work, didn't see anything, didn't notice Martha half opening the door. He heard nothing, not even the voice of the faithful servant. "Will sir be dining tonight?" Martha had to go away again without a response. As for myself, after fighting it for some time, an irresistible drowsiness came over me, and I fell asleep on the end of the sofa, while my Uncle Lidenbrock continued his adding up, his taking away, and his crossing out. When I woke again the following morning, the inexorable worker was still at it. His eyes were red, his face pale, his hair tousled by a feverish hand, and his cheekbones glowed purple. All were signs of a terrible struggle with the impossible, showing what tiredness of mind and what exertions of the brain must have filled the long hours. I was genuinely sorry for him. In spite of the reproaches I probably had the right to make, I felt considerable pity. With a single act, I could undo the iron hoop wrapped tight around his brain, with just one word. I did nothing. But I had a kind heart. Why did I not speak out in such circumstances? For my uncle's own sake? No, I repeated, no. I'm not going to say anything. He would only want to go there. I know him. Nothing would stop him. He has a volcanic imagination, and he would risk his life to do what no geologist has ever done before. I will not say anything. I will keep this secret given to me by chance, and to let it out would be tantamount to killing Professor Lidenbrock. Let him guess if he can. I don't want to feel responsible one day for having sent him to his death. Once my mind was made up, I crossed my arms and waited. But I hadn't reckoned with something that happened a few hours later. When Martha tried to go out to the market, she found the door locked. The big key was not in the keyhole. Who had taken it out? Obviously my uncle when he had come back from his hasty excursion the day before. Was it on purpose or through absent-mindedness? Did he want us to feel real hunger pains? That seemed to be going a bit far. Why should Martha and I suffer because of a situation that had nothing whatsoever to do with us? But apparently this was the case, and I recalled a frightening precedent. A few years before, when my uncle had been working on his grand mineral classification, he had remained 48 hours without eating, and his whole household had had to follow his scientific diet. As a result, I acquired stomach cramps that were not much fun for a boy of a fairly ravenous nature. I resolved to be heroic, and not to give in to the demands of hunger. At about 12 o'clock, though, hunger began to cause me serious problems. Martha very innocently had devoured the supplies in the larder the day before, and so there was nothing left in the whole house. I held on, however. I considered it a matter of honour. 2 o'clock chimed. The situation was becoming ridiculous, intolerable even. My eyes began to look very big. I started to tell myself that I was exaggerating the importance of the document, that in any case my uncle wouldn't believe what it said, that he would regard it as a mere practical joke, that if the worst came to the worst, he could be restrained against his will if he wanted to attempt the expedition, and that he might easily find the code himself, in which case all my efforts of abstinence would have been in vain. These all seemed excellent reasons to me, although I would have indignantly rejected them the day before. I even considered it a terrible mistake to have waited so long, and I made up my mind to reveal all. I was therefore looking for a way into the subject, one that wasn't too sudden, when without warning the professor stood up, put his hat on, and got ready to go out. "Uncle!" He didn't appear to have heard. "Uncle Lidenbrock!" I repeated, raising my voice. He said, like someone abruptly woken. "What about the key?"
"What key? The door?"
"No," I cried. "The key to the document!" The professor scrutinized me over his glasses. He must have noticed something unusual in my face, for he firmly grabbed me by the arm while still carefully inspecting me, although unable to utter a word. All the same, never was a question asked more clearly. I moved my head up and down. He shook his with a sort of pity, as if dealing with a lunatic. I made a more positive sign. His eyes shone brighter. His hand became threatening. Given the situation, this silent conversation would have absorbed the most indifferent spectator. I had, in fact, really reached the point of not daring to say anything. Such was my fear of my uncle suffocating me when he first began to joyfully embrace me. But he became so insistent that I just had to speak. "Yes, the code, purely by chance." I hadn't finished before the professor produced a shout, more than a shout, an actual roar. A revelation had just occurred in his brain. His face was transmogrified.
"Oh, clever old Saknussemm," he bellowed. "So you wrote your message backwards!"
And throwing himself on the sheet of paper, his eyes unfocused, his voice trembling, he spelled out the whole document, working his way from the last letter back to the first. This is what he read.
"In Schneffels loculis craterem chem delibat umbra scataris Julii intra calendas descende audas viator et terrestre centrum attinges code feci Arne Saknussemm,"
which translates as, "Go down into the crater of Schneffelsjökull, which the shadow of Scataris caresses before the calends of July, O audacious traveller, and you will reach the centre of the earth." I did it. Arne Saknussemm. As he read, my uncle jumped up, as if drawing current from a Leyden jar. His courage, his joy, his certainty knew no bounds. He walked up and down, he held his head in both hands, he moved the chairs around, he piled the books up. Unbelievably, he juggled with his precious geodes. He threw a punch here and a blow there. At last his nerves calmed down, and like a man exhausted, he flopped back in his armchair.
"So, what time is it?"
he asked after a few moments' silence. 3 o'clock, I replied.
"Lunch has gone down quickly. I'm dying of hunger. To table. And then, after that, you can pack our trunks."
The professor's words had sent a shiver through my whole body. I kept my self-control, though. I even resolved to put on a brave face. Only scientific arguments could stop Professor Lidenbrock now, and there were no lack of arguments, and good ones, against such a journey being possible. Go to the centre of the earth? What madness! I had to try to persuade him against such a crazy scheme, and said, "Couldn't the old parchment just be a practical joke?" A sort of smile played over my stern questioner's lips, and he replied,
"That is what we are going to find out."
I said, a little annoyed. "Allow me first to exhaust all possible objections concerning the document."
"Speak, my boy. Give yourself full rein. I grant you every freedom to express your opinion. You are no longer my nephew, but my colleague. Pray proceed."
Well, I will first ask you what Jökull, Snaffles, and Scataris mean, since I have never even heard of them.
"That's easy. As it happens, I received a map not very long ago from my friend August Petermann of Leipzig. It couldn't have arrived at a better time. Take down the third atlas on the second shelf in the big bookcase, Series Z, shelf 4.
I got up and, thanks to the precise instructions, quickly found the required atlas. My uncle opened it.
"See this island of volcanoes," said the professor, "and notice that they all bear the name Jökull. This means glacier in Icelandic, and at the northern latitude, most of the eruptions reach the light of day through layers of ice. Hence this name, Jökull, applied to all fire-producing peaks of the island."
Fine, but what about Schneefels?
I hoped there would be no answer to this question.
I was wrong.
"Follow me along the western coast of Iceland. Do you see Reykjavik, the capital? Yes. Good. Work your way up along the countless fjords of these shorelines, eaten by the sea, and stop a little before the line of 65 degrees north. What do you see?"
A peninsula rather like a bare bone with an enormous kneecap at the end, I said.
Not an inappropriate comparison, my dear boy. Now, do you see anything on the kneecap?
Yes, a mountain that looks as if it sprouted in the middle of the sea.
Good, that is Schneefels, said the professor.
Schneefels?
The one and only, a 5,000-foot-high mountain, one of the most remarkable on the island, and definitely the most famous in the whole world if its crater leads to the center of the globe.
But it's quite impossible, I said, raising my shoulders in protest at such a conjecture.
Impossible? Said Professor Lidenbrock severely. And why should that be?
Because this crater is obviously blocked up with lava and scorching rocks, and so...
And supposing it is an extinct crater?
Extinct?
Yes. There are now only about 300 volcanoes in activity on the surface of the Earth, but the number of extinct ones is much greater. Schneefels falls into this latter category, and in historical times has only had a single eruption, the 1219 one. Since then its rumblings have gradually died down, and it is no longer considered an active volcano.
But what does the word Scartaris mean? And what have the calends of July got to do with anything? I asked. My uncle had an answer to that question too. Our Icelandic scholar observed that as the calends of July approached, that is, towards the end of June, one of the mountain peaks called Scartaris cast its shadow as far as the opening of the relevant crater, and he noted this fact in his document. Could he have found a more precise indication, and once we are on the summit of Schneefels, can there be a moment's hesitation as to the path to follow? But I couldn't give up so easily and said, all right. I'm forced to accept that Saknussemm's message is clear and that can leave no doubt in one's mind. I even grant that the document looks perfectly authentic. So, this scholar went to the bottom of Schneefels, saw the shadow of Scartaris lingering on the edge of the crater just before the calends of July. He probably even heard the people of this time recounting legends that this crater led to the center of the Earth. But as to whether he went down there himself, whether he carried out the journey and came back, whether he even undertook it, no, 100 times no. And the reason? Asked my uncle in a singularly mocking tone. Because all the scientific theories demonstrate that such an undertaking is impossible.
All the theories say that? Replied the professor, putting on a good-natured appearance. Oh, the nasty theories. They are going to get terribly in our way, the poor theories.
I could see that he was making fun of me, but continued regardless. Yes, it is well known that the temperature increases by approximately 1 degree centigrade for every 70 feet you go below the surface of the globe. Now, assuming that this ratio remains constant, and given that the radius of the Earth is about 4,000 miles, the temperature at the center will be well over 200,000 degrees centigrade. The substances at the Earth's core exist, therefore, as white-hot gases, for even metals like gold or platinum, even the hardest rocks cannot resist such a temperature. My question whether it is possible to travel in such an environment is consequently a reasonable one. So, Axel, it is the heat that bothers you? Certainly. If we were to attain a depth of only 25 miles, we would have reached the limit of the Earth's crust, for the temperature would already be more than 1,400 degrees centigrade. And are you afraid of melting? I leave the question for you to decide, I replied sharply. Here is what I decide, said Professor Lidenbrock, assuming an important air. It is that neither you nor anyone else knows for certain what happens in the Earth's interior, given that scarcely a 12,000th part of its radius is known. It is that science is eminently perfectible, and that each existing theory is constantly replaced by a new one.
Was it not believed before Fourier that the temperature of interplanetary space went down indefinitely? And is it not known now that the greatest cold in the ether does not go below 40 or 50 degrees below zero? Why should it not be the same for the internal heat? Why, at a certain depth, should it not encounter a limit that cannot be crossed, instead of reaching the point where the most obdurate minerals liquefy? You see, Axel, the state of the central core has produced various hypotheses among geologists. Nothing is less proven than the idea of internal heat. In my view, it does not exist, could not possibly exist. In any case, we shall see for ourselves, and like Arne Saknussemm, discover where we stand on this important question.
Yes, we shall see, I shouted, won over by his excitement.
We'll see for ourselves, provided, that is, anything at all can be seen down there. And why not? Can we not count on electrical phenomena to light the way, and even on the atmosphere, which the pressure may make more and more luminous as the centre approaches?
Yes, it's possible after all, I said.
It is certain, retorted my uncle in triumph. But it must be kept quiet, do you hear? All this must be maintained totally secret, so that no one else has the idea of discovering the centre of the earth before us.
Our journey began the very next day. We crossed the border into Holstein province, where we boarded a train bound for Kiel, then by steamship to Copenhagen, sailing on the Eleonora. I had hoped that no means of transport would be available, but this was not to be. A little Danish schooner, the Valkyrie, was due to sail for Reykjavik on the 2nd of June. The captain, a Mr. Bjarne, was on board. His future passenger, overjoyed, shook his hand hard enough to break it. This simple man was surprised by such a grip. He found it quite normal to go to Iceland. That was his job. But my uncle found it sublime. The worthy captain took advantage of my uncle's enthusiasm to make us pay double for the voyage. But we weren't bothered by such trifles. At 6 a.m. on the 2nd, our precious luggage was already stowed on board the Valkyrie. The captain led us down to the cabins that were rather narrow and situated under a sort of deck house.
"Is the wind with us?"
inquired my uncle. "Perfectly," replied Captain Bjarne. "From the southeast. We can leave the Sound with a wind on the quarter and all sails set."
"How long will the voyage take?"
asked my uncle. "About 10 days if we don't have too many nor'easters windward of the Faroes."
"But you don't normally encounter significant delays?"
"No, Professor Lidenbrock. Don't worry, we'll get there." The captain was as good as his word. The crossing passed uneventfully, and although the professor endured some seasickness, before long we sighted to the east the beacon of Point Skagen, whose dangerous rocks extend a long way out under the waves. An Icelandic pilot came on board, and 3 hours later the Valkyrie dropped anchor in Faxe Bay, beside Reykjavik itself. The professor finally came out of his cabin, a little pale and a little shaky, but still enthusiastic and with a gleam of satisfaction in his eye. The population of the town, enthralled by the arrival of a ship in which each expected something, congregated on the quayside. My uncle was in a hurry to flee this floating prison, but before leaving the deck of the schooner, he dragged me forward. There, near the northern part of the bay, stood a high mountain, with 2 points on top, a double cone covered with perpetual snows.
"Schniffels!"
he roared.
"Schniffels!"
He made a sign indicating total secrecy, and then climbed down into the waiting boat. Soon we were standing on the soil of Iceland itself. A charming citizen, whose help became extremely precious, was Mr. Fridriksson, who taught science at Reykjavik School. This humble scholar spoke only Icelandic and Latin. He came and offered his services in the language of Horace, and I felt that we were bound to understand each other. He was in fact the only person I could converse with my entire stay in Iceland. Of the 3 rooms making up his household, this excellent man put 2 at our disposal, and soon we were ensconced there together with our luggage, whose quantity slightly surprised the inhabitants of Reykjavik.
"Well, Axel," said my uncle, "things are working out. We are over the worst."
"What do you mean, the worst?"
"I mean it's downhill all the way."
"In that sense you are right. But having gone down, won't we eventually have to come back up?"
"Oh, that will present no problem. Look, there is no time to be lost. I am going to visit the library. It might contain some manuscript of Saknussemm's, And if so, I would very much like to have a look at it.
Well then, during that time I'll visit the town. Aren't you going to have a look at it yourself?
To tell the truth, I am not very much drawn by all that. What is interesting in this country of Iceland is below the ground, not above.
I went out and walked around at random. To get lost in the 2 streets of Reykjavik would have been difficult. After a good walk, I returned to Mr. Fridrikson's house. My uncle was already there, together with his host. Dinner was ready. It was devoured with great gusto by Professor Lidenbrock, whose stomach had become a deep chasm during the forced abstinence on board. The meal, more Danish than Icelandic, involved nothing remarkable in itself, but our host, more Icelandic than Danish, reminded me of the heroes of classical hospitality. Conversation used the native tongue, interspersed for my sake with German by my uncle and Latin by Mr. Fridrikson. It concerned scientific subjects, as is appropriate for scholars, but Professor Lidenbrock maintained a very strict reserve, and at each sentence his eyes told me to keep a total silence about our future plans. First, Mr. Fridrikson questioned my uncle about the results of his research in the library. I looked at my uncle. He could not decide whether or not to reply. This matter concerned his projects directly. However, after thinking for a while, he decided to speak.
Sir Fridrikson, I wish to know whether you have amongst the oldest works those of a certain Arne Saknussemm.
Arne Saknussemm? You are referring to that scholar of the 18th century, who was a great naturalist, a great alchemist, and a great traveller?
Precisely.
One of the stars of Icelandic literature and science.
As you so well put it.
One of the most illustrious of men.
Most certainly.
And whose courage was as great as his genius?
I see you know him perfectly.
My uncle was in ecstasy to hear his hero spoken of in this way. He was devouring Mr. Fridrikson with his eyes.
Well, he asked, what about his works?
His works, we do not have.
What? Even in Iceland?
They do not exist in Iceland or anywhere else.
And why ever not?
Because Arne Saknussemm was persecuted for heresy, and his works were burned in Copenhagen in 1573 by the hand of the executioner.
Good! Splendid!
Shouted my uncle, greatly shocking the science teacher.
Eh?
Yes! Everything is explained. Everything fits together. All is clear. And now I understand why Saknussemm, having been forced to hide the discoveries of his genius, had to conceal the secret in an incomprehensible word puzzle.
What secret?
Inquired Mr. Fridrikson keenly.
A secret that by means of...
spluttered my uncle.
Do you by any chance have some special document?
No, I was making a pure supposition,
said my uncle.
Fine,
replied Mr. Fridrikson, who had observed my uncle's confusion and was kind enough not to insist. My uncle told Mr. Fridrikson of our wish to explore the extinct volcano, Snæfellsnes, and our kindly host promised to provide us with a guide on the morrow. In the evening, I went for a brief walk along the seafront of Reykjavik, came back early and then retired to my bed of rough planks, where I slept the sleep of the just. On waking up, I heard my uncle talking volubly in the next room. I quickly got up and joined him. He was speaking Danish with a tall man, robustly built. This great strapping figure was clearly of unusual strength. His eyes, in a head of very considerable size, and a certain naivety, appeared intelligent to me. They were of a dreamy blue colour. Long hair, which would have passed for red even in Britain, fell on athletic shoulders. This native was supple in his movements, but moved his arms little, like a man who didn't know the language of gestures or didn't bother to use it. Everything about him revealed a perfectly calm nature, not lazy, but composed. You felt that he didn't require anything from anyone, that he worked as it suited him, that his philosophy of life couldn't be astonished or disturbed by anything in this world. I was able to detect the nuances of the Icelander's character by the way he listened to the passionate flow of words addressed to him. He remained with his arms crossed, not moving despite my uncle's repeated gesticulations. To say no, his head turned from left to right. To say yes, downwards, but so little that his long hair hardly moved. He was not so much economical with his movements as tight-fisted. This serious, phlegmatic, silent type was called Hans Bjelke, and he came with Mr. Fridrikson's recommendations. He was our future guide, whose manner contrasted singularly with my uncle's. Nevertheless, they got on well from the start. Neither of them discussed prices, The one ready to accept whatever was offered, the other to pay whatever was asked. Never was a deal easier to reach. Once the agreement had been reached, the hunter promptly left.
"He's perfect," exclaimed my uncle, "but he can hardly realize the brilliant part he is going to play."
"So he's coming with us?"
"To the center of the earth."
There were still 48 hours left, but to my great regret I had to use them for the preparations. All our intelligence was employed organizing the things in the most useful way. The instruments here, the firearms there, the tools in this package, the food in that. 4 groups in all. The instruments included a centigrade thermometer made by Axel, graduated to 150 degrees, which didn't seem quite right to me. Too much if the temperature went up as far as that, since we would be cooked, but not enough to measure the temperature of hot springs or other molten substances. A manometer, operated by compressed air, designed to show pressures greater than that at sea level. An ordinary barometer would not have been sufficient, given that the atmospheric pressure was due to increase proportionally with our descent underground. A chronometer by Boissonnas Jr. of Geneva, perfectly set to the Hamburg meridian. 2 compasses to measure positive and negative inclination. A night glass. 2 Ruhmkorff lamps, which used an electric current to give a highly portable source of light, reliable and not too bulky. The arms consisted of 2 rifles from Purdley Moore & Co. and 2 Colt revolvers. Why take them? I didn't imagine we were going to encounter all that many savages or wild beasts, but my uncle seemed very attached to his arsenal and his instruments, and especially to a considerable quantity of gun cotton, which is unaffected by damp and whose explosive power is far greater than that of ordinary powder. The tools were 2 ice picks, 2 pickaxes, 1 ladder made of silk, 3 alpenstocks, 1 axe, 1 hammer, a dozen iron wedges and pitons, and several long knotted ropes. This could not help making a large packet, for the ladder alone was 300 feet in length. Finally, there were the provisions. The parcel was not a big one, but was reassuring, for I knew that it contained 6 months' supply of dried meat and biscuits. Gin was the only liquid, with water totally absent. We had flasks, and my uncle counted on springs to fill them. The objections I raised as to their quality, temperature, and even existence were ignored. To complete the list of our travel items, I will mention a portable medical kit containing blunt-bladed scissors, splints for fractures, a strip of Holland material, bandages and compresses, sticking plaster, a basin for bloodletting. Terrifying objects in themselves, but in addition a whole series of bottles containing dextrin, surgical spirit, liquid acetate of lead, ether, vinegar and ammonia, all drugs of a frightening nature. And finally the materials necessary for the Ruhmkorff lamps. My uncle was careful not to forget a supply of tobacco, powder for hunting and tinder, nor a leather belt he wore round his waist, and which contained an adequate supply of money in gold, silver and paper form. 6 stout pairs of shoes, waterproofed by means of a coating of tar and gutta percha, fell into the category of miscellaneous items. The following day, our preparations were finished. Our host delighted the professor by presenting him with a chart of Iceland, which was incomparably better than Henderson's. It was the map drawn up by Mr. Olaf Nicholas Olsen, on a scale of 1 to 480,000, published by the Icelandic Literary Society, and based on Mr. Schiel Friesak's geodesic work, and Mr. Bjorn Gumlagsson's topographical survey. It constituted a precious document for a mineralogist. We left in overcast but settled weather. No exhausting heat to fear, no disastrous rain. Weather for tourists. The joy of riding through an unknown land made me easy to please at the beginning of our adventure. I was caught up in the happiness of those who go on journeys, a feeling of hope mixed with a sense of freedom. I began to feel involved in the trip. Hans walked in front, at a quick but regular and unchanging pace. The 2 horses followed with our luggage, without his having to lead them. My uncle and I came last, trying not to make too much of a sight of ourselves on our small but hardy mounts.
"Nice animal, nice animal," my uncle kept saying. "You will see, Axel, that a creature more intelligent than the Icelandic horse does not exist. Snows, storms, blocked paths, rocks, glaciers, nothing stops him. He is brave, he is cautious, he is reliable. Never a foot wrong, never a false reaction. Should a stream appear, a fjord to be crossed, and they will appear, You will see him throw himself unhesitatingly into the water like an amphibian and swim across to the other side. If we do not upset him, if we let him do as he wishes, we shall cover our 25 miles a day, the one carrying the other.
We will, I'm sure, but what about the guide?
Oh, I am not worried about him. That sort of person walks without noticing. Our guide moves so little that he cannot possibly get tired. In any case, I will give him my horse if need be. I would soon get cramps if I did not take some exercise. My arms feel all right, but one must not neglect one's legs.
For several days we travelled thus, until eventually we arrived at a place called Stapi. Stapi is a settlement of about 30 shacks, built on the lava itself and under the rays of the sun reflected from the volcano. It lies at the end of a little fjord which forms part of a basalt wall of a most curious appearance. Here, Hans hired the services of 3 Icelanders to replace the horses carrying the luggage. Once we got to the bottom of the crater, these locals would have to turn back, leaving us on our own. That point was made clear. At this juncture, my uncle had to tell our guide of his intention to continue his exploration of the volcano to its furthermost limits. Hans merely inclined his head. Whether he went there or somewhere else, whether he plunged into the innards of his island or travelled over its surface, made no difference to him. I myself had rather forgotten about the future, distracted until this point by the events of the journey, but now felt my feelings taking hold of me more than ever. What could I do? If I had wanted to try and stand up to Professor Lidenbrock, it ought to have been in Hamburg, and not at the foot of Schneefels. My uncle had defeated me by means of scientific arguments. I had one remaining hope, however, that once we had got to the bottom of the crater, it would be impossible, for lack of gallery, to go any deeper, in spite of all the Saknussemms in the world. I spent the night in the clutches of a nightmare. I was in the middle of a volcano in the depths of the earth. I felt as if I was being thrown into interplanetary space in the form of eruptive rock. The following day, the 23rd of June, Hans was waiting for us with his companions who were loaded down with food, tools and instruments. 2 of the iron-tipped sticks, 2 rifles and 2 cartridge belts were set aside for my uncle and myself. Hans, a man of foresight, had added to our bags a full goatskin water bottle, which, together with our flasks, meant we had water for a week. Schneefels is 5,000 feet high. Its double cone marks the end of a trachytic strip which branches off the main relief system of the island. From our point of departure, we couldn't see its 2 peaks in profile against the greyish background of the sky. I could only see an enormous snowy cap lowered on the giant's forehead. We were walking in single file, following the hunter. He was climbing up narrow paths where 2 men couldn't have proceeded abreast. All conversation, therefore, became more or less impossible. 3 hours' tiring march had only brought us as far as the base of the mountain. At this point, Hans called a halt, and we all shared a quick lunch. My uncle took double mouthfuls to save time, but since this halt was also a rest period, he was forced to wait until the guide was completely ready. He gave the signal for departure an hour later. The 3 Icelanders, as taciturn as their hunter companion, didn't say a single word and ate soberly. We now began to move up the slopes of Schneefels. By an optical illusion common with mountains, its snow-covered summit seemed to me very close, and yet how many long hours it took to reach it. Above all, what fatigue! The stones, not held together by earth or grass, rolled away from under our feet and disappeared towards the plain with the speed of an avalanche. To judge from the height of the peak of Schneefels, I assumed it was impossible for us to reach it from this side, unless the angle of the slope decreased. Fortunately, after an hour of tiring efforts and considerable feats, a sort of staircase suddenly appeared in the middle of a vast carpet of snow built up on top of the volcano, and this helped our climb. It was formed by one of those rivers of stones thrown out by the eruptions. By 7 in the evening, we had climbed the 2,000 steps of the staircase. We stood at the top of a big swelling of the mountain, a sort of base on which rested the cone forming the crater. The sea stretched out at a depth of 3,200 feet. We were above the line of the perpetual snows, at a relatively low level in Iceland because of the constant humidity of the climate. It was bitterly cold. The wind blew hard. I felt utterly exhausted. The professor saw clearly that my legs were refusing to carry me and decided to stop, despite his impatience. He therefore made a sign to the hunter, who shook his head, saying, "Ofanfur. Apparently we need to go higher." He asked Hans the reason for this reply. "Mistur." "Ja, Mistur," repeated one of the Icelanders in a frightened tone. "What does the word mean?" I asked anxiously. "Look there," replied my uncle. I turned to look at the plain. An immense column of ground-up pumice stone, sand and dust was climbing, swirling like a waterspout. The wind was driving it against the flank of Snæfell's, which we were now clinging onto. This opaque curtain spread out in front of the sun and threw a large shadow over the whole mountain. "Hastig! Hastig!" shouted the guide. Without knowing Danish, I understood we had to follow Hans as quickly as possible. He began to work his way round the cone of the crater at an angle for easier going. Soon the waterspout crashed down on the mountain, which quivered at the shock. The stones caught up in the eddies rained down as if in an eruption. Fortunately, we were on the other side and sheltered from all danger. If it hadn't been for the guide's precaution, our torn bodies would have been pulverized and dropped far away like the product of some unknown meteor. However, Hans didn't consider it prudent to spend the night on the side of the cone. We continued our zigzagging ascent. The 1,500 feet still to be covered took nearly 5 hours, for the detours, diagonal paths and retreats measured at least 8 miles. I couldn't go on. I was overcome by cold and hunger. The air was slightly rarefied and insufficient to fill my lungs. Finally, at 11 at night, very much in darkness, we reached the summit of Snæfell's. Before going to shelter inside the crater, I caught sight of the midnight sun at the lowest point in its life's course, sending its pale rays over the island asleep at my feet. Next day, my uncle was anxious to continue our journey. "To the crater," he said, rising early. The crater of Snæfell's formed an inverted cone, whose mouth was probably slightly more than a mile across. It seemed to me to be about 2,000 feet deep. One should imagine the state of such a receptacle when it was filling up with thunder and flames. The bottom of the funnel was only about 500 feet in circumference, so its relatively gentle slopes allowed one to reach the lower part with ease. I couldn't help comparing this crater to an enormous widened-out blunderbuss, and the comparison terrified me. To climb down into a blunderbuss, I thought, when it may be loaded and could go off at the least shock, you've got to be crazy. But there was no going back. With an indifferent expression, Hans took the lead. I followed him without a word. At the bottom of the crater opened 3 vents, through which, at the time when Snæfell's used to erupt, the central fire forced its lava and its steam. Each of these chimneys was about 100 feet across. There they were, wide open beneath our feet. I didn't dare look down into them. As for Professor Lidenbrock, he had quickly examined their shape and size. He was breathing heavily, running from one to the other, waving his arms and shouting unintelligible words. Hans and his companions sat on hummocks of lava and watched. They clearly took him for a madman. Suddenly my uncle cried out. At first I thought he had lost his footing and fallen into one of the 3 holes. But then I saw him, standing arms outstretched and legs apart in front of a granite boulder placed at the center of the crater, like an enormous pedestal designed for a statue of Pluto. He stood like a man dumbstruck, but it soon turned instead into an insane happiness. "Axel! Axel, come here! Down here!" I ran down. Hans and the Icelanders stayed exactly where they were. "Look," said the professor. Dumbstruck like him, but markedly less happy, I read on the western side of the boulder, in runic characters gnawed by time, the 1,000 times accursed name. "Arne Saknussemm!" shouted my uncle. "Can you have any doubt now?" I didn't reply, but came back to my lava seat in a state of total confusion. I was crushed by the evidence. The following day, a grey sky, cloudy and heavy, lowered over the summit of the cone. I noticed this less from the darkness of the chasm than from the anger that took hold of my uncle. I understood why, and at last a feeling of hope came back to me. The reason was as follows. Of the 3 routes open under our feet, only one had been followed by Saknussemm.
According to the Icelandic scholar, it was to be identified by the particularity described in the cryptogram, namely that the shadow of Scartaris came and played along its edge during the last few days of the month of June. This sharp peak could thus be described as a huge sundial, whose silhouette on a given day marked the way to the centre of our globe. If, by chance, the sun was not there, no shadow, consequently no sign. It was the 25th of June. Should the sky stay overcast for 6 more days, the expedition would have to be put off to another year. I will not attempt to describe Professor Lidenbrock's impotent rage. The day passed without a shadow coming down to the bottom of the crater. Hans didn't move from where he was, although he must have wondered what we were waiting for, if he wondered anything. My uncle didn't address a single word to me. His eyes invariably turned to the sky, blended into the grey and misty background. On the 26th, still nothing. Rain mixed with snow fell during the day. Hans built a hut with pieces of lava. I took some pleasure from watching the thousands of improvised cascades running down the sides of the cone, with each stone adding to the deafening murmur. My uncle could no longer hold himself back. The most patient man could legitimately be irritated, for this really was sinking while coming into harbour. The sky was still covered the following day. But on Sunday the 28th of June, the third last day of the month, the change of the moon coincided with a change in the weather. The sun poured its abundant rays down into the crater. Each hummock, each rock, each boulder, each bump had its share of the luminous flow, and instantly cast its shadow on the ground. That of Scartaris especially stood out like a sharp stone and began to turn imperceptibly with the radiant orb. My uncle turned with it. At the middle of the day, when it was shortest, it came and gently kissed the edge of the middle chimney.
"It is there! There it is!" shouted the professor. "To the centre of the globe," he added in Danish.
I looked at Hans.
"Forward,"
he said calmly.
"Forward!"
replied my uncle. It was 13 minutes past 1. The real journey began. Until now, things had been more tiring than difficult, but henceforth problems were literally going to spring forth under our feet. The middle chimney was 100 feet across, or about 300 feet right round. I leant over an overhanging rock and looked. My hair stood on end. An impression of void took hold of my being. I felt the centre of gravity moving through me and dizziness going to my head like a heady brew. The descent began in the following order: Hans, my uncle, myself. It proceeded in deep silence, broken only by rock debris falling into the abyss. I allowed myself to flow, so to speak, with one hand desperately holding onto the double rope, and the other using my alpenstock to slow me down. A single idea obsessed me. I was afraid of losing all means of support. This rope seemed to me very fragile for bearing the weight of 3 people. I used it as little as possible, performing miracles of balance on the lava projections that my foot tried to hold onto like a hand. When one of these precarious steps happened to dislodge under Hans's feet, he would say in his calm voice, "Give acht."
"Careful,"
repeated my uncle. After half an hour we had reached the top of a boulder, solidly attached to the wall of the chimney. Hans pulled one of the ends of the rope, and the other rose in the air. Having gone round the rock at the top, it fell back, dragging down pieces of rock and lava, a sort of rain or rather hail full of danger. Leaning over our narrow platform, I noticed that the bottom of the hole could still not be seen. The rope maneuver began again, and half an hour later we had got 200 feet deeper. After some time of this slow descent, I calculated that we had used the rope 14 times, taking half an hour each time. So we'd spent 7 hours plus 14 rest periods of 15 minutes, or 3.5 hours, 10.5 in total. Since we had left at 1, it had to be about 11 now. As for the depth reached, the 14 operations of the rope gave 2,800 feet. At that moment Hans's voice was heard. "Halt." I stopped dead at the moment my feet were about to collide with my uncle's head. "We are there," he said. "Where?" I asked, slipping down beside him. "At the bottom of the perpendicular chimney." "And is there a way out?" "Yes. I can just see a sort of corridor at an angle towards the right."
We will have a look at it tomorrow. Let's eat, and then we can sleep.
It was still not completely dark. We opened the food bag, ate, and lay down, each doing his best to make a bed out of the stone and lava debris. Lying on my back, I opened my eyes and caught sight of a brilliant object at the other end of the 3,000-foot-long tube, converted into a giant telescope. It was a star, but not twinkling at all. According to my calculations, it was Beta of the Little Bear. Then I fell into a deep sleep. At 8 in the morning, a ray of daylight came and woke us up. The 1,000 facets of the lava on the walls picked it up on the way down and scattered it everywhere like a rain of sparks. These gleams were enough for us to be able to distinguish the surrounding objects. My uncle pulled from his pocket a notebook designed for observations. He examined each of the various instruments in turn and wrote down the date. Monday, the 1st of July. Chronometer, 8:17 anti-meridian. Barometer, 29 7/12. Thermometer, 6 degrees centigrade. Direction, east, southeast. The last observation referred to the dark corridor as indicated by the compass. Now, Axel, cried the professor enthusiastically, we are going to penetrate the globe's bowels proper. This is the precise moment when our journey begins. Saying that, with one hand he took the Ruhmkorff lamp, which was hanging round his neck. With the other he applied the electric current to the filament of the lamp, and a brightish light chased the darkness away. During its last eruption, the lava had forced its way through the tunnel. It had carpeted the inside with a thick, shiny coating. The electric light was now reflected in it, becoming 100 times brighter. The lava, porous in places, was covered with little round bulbs. Crystals of opaque quartz, decorated with clear drops of glass, hung from the vaulted ceiling like chandeliers, and seemed to light up as we passed. It was as if the spirits of the underground were lighting up their palace to welcome their guests from the earth. "It's magnificent!" I shouted in spite of myself. "What a sight, Uncle! Look at the colours in the lava which go from reddish-brown to bright yellow, absolutely continuously. And these crystals that look like luminous globes." "Ah, you are getting there, Axel. So, you admire all that, my boy. You will see lots more, I hope. Come on, off we go." At about 8 in the evening, he gave the signal to stop. Hans immediately sat down. The lamps were hung from convenient pieces of lava. We were in a sort of cavern, where there was no lack of air. On the contrary, we felt a wind blowing. What was causing it? What movement in the atmosphere did it come from? I wasn't really interested in answering the question at that moment. Hunger and tiredness made me unable to think. A descent of 7 hours without stopping produces a great depletion of energy. I was exhausted, and had been very glad to hear the word halt. Hans spread out a few things to eat on a block of lava, and each of us dined hungrily. One thing worried me, though. Half our supply of water had been used up. My uncle planned to replenish it at underwater springs, but there hadn't been a single one so far. I couldn't help mentioning it to him. "Are you surprised by the absence of streams?" "Yes, and even worried. We have water left for only 5 days. "Oh, don't worry, Axel. My reply is that we will find water, and more than we want." "When?" "When we have left the lava envelope. How do you think that springs can get through these walls?" "But the lava flow may continue to a great depth, and we don't seem to have gone very far yet in a vertical direction." "What makes you say that?" "Because if we had gone a long way into the interior of the Earth's crust, the heat would be greater than it is." "According to your system. What does the thermometer say?" "Hardly 15 degrees, which is only 9 degrees more than when we left." "And your conclusion?" "Well, I conclude as follows. From the most precise observations, we know that the temperature increases by 1 degree for every 100 feet you go into the interior of the globe. But local conditions can sometimes alter that figure. Thus, in Yakutsk in Siberia, it has been observed that the increase is 1 degree for every 36 feet. The difference clearly depends on the conductivity of the rock. One can also add that in the neighborhood of an extinct volcano, through the gneiss, the increase is only 1 degree for every 125 feet. Let us therefore take this last hypothesis, which is the most favorable, and let us calculate." "Calculate on, my boy?" "It's child's play," I said, jotting the figures down in my notebook. 9 times 125 feet gives 1,125 feet deep. "So it does?" Well?
Well, according to my observations, we are now 10,000 feet below sea level.
Are we really?
Yes, or else figures are no longer figures.
The professor's calculations were correct. We had gone 6,000 feet further than the greatest depths achieved by man, such as the mines of Kitzbühel in the Tyrol, or those of Württemberg in Bohemia. The temperature, which should have been 81 degrees at this spot, was barely 15. At 6 a.m. the following day, Tuesday the 30th of June, the journey began again. We were still following the lava gallery, truly a natural ramp, as gentle as those inclined planes that still replace staircases in old houses. This continued until 12:17, the precise moment when we caught up with Hans, who had just stopped.
"Ah!" exclaimed my uncle, "we have reached the end of the chimney."
I looked around. We were in the middle of an intersection, with two paths heading forward, both of them dark and narrow. Which one were we to take? We had a problem. But my uncle didn't want to appear to be hesitating before either me or the guide. He pointed to the eastern tunnel, and soon all three of us had plunged into it. In any case, any deliberation about the choice of path could have gone on indefinitely, for no sign could possibly determine the choice of one or the other. We had to trust entirely to chance. 6 hours later, after a relatively easy march, we had covered 5 miles in a southerly direction, but scarcely a quarter of a mile in depth. My uncle gave the signal to stop. We ate without talking very much, and then went to sleep without thinking very much. Our arrangements for the night were very simple. Travelling rugs in which we rolled ourselves up were our sole bedding. We had no fear of cold, nor of surprise visits. Those travellers who penetrate to the middle of deserts of Africa or the heart of the forests of the New World are forced to watch over each other during the hours of sleep. But here, absolute solitude, and complete safety. Savages or wild beasts, none of these dangers were to be feared. In the morning we awoke. As I had foreseen, our water had given out completely, and we began to suffer the tortures of thirst. However, Hans led the way as usual. We hadn't gone further than 100 yards, when the professor, shining his lamp along the walls, bellowed,
"These are primitive terrains! We are on the right route! Come on! Come on!"
When the earth slowly cooled during the first days of the world, the decrease in volume produced disruptions, breakages, shrinkages, and cracks in the crust. Our present corridor was a fissure of this sort, through which the eruption of the liquid granite had formerly poured out. Its 1,000 paths formed an impossible maze through the primeval ground. As we went further down, the succession of strata making up the primitive terrain appeared more and more clearly. Geological science considers the primitive terrain as the base of the mineral crust, and has analysed it into 3 different strata: schists, gneisses, and mica-schists, resting on that immovable rock called granite. Never had mineralogists been in such perfect circumstances for studying nature in situ. The drill, a brutal and unintelligent machine, could not bring its internal texture back to the surface of the globe, but we were going to examine it with our eyes, touch it with our hands. Through the layer of schists, coloured in wonderful green shades, there meandered metallic seams of copper and manganese, with traces of platinum and gold. I dreamed when I saw these riches, hidden away in the bowels of the earth, which human greed would never enjoy. These treasures were so deeply buried by the upheavals of the first days that neither pick nor drill will ever be able to tear them from their tomb. It was 8 in the evening, and we had still not found any water, and I was in terrible pain. My uncle walked ahead. He wouldn't stop. He kept turning his head in order to detect murmurs from any spring, but none came. Meanwhile, my legs refused to carry me any further. I resisted the agony so that my uncle would not have to call a halt. It would have been a blow of despair for him, as the day was coming to an end, the last one we had. Finally, my strength left me. I uttered a cry and fell down. "Help! I'm dying!" My uncle came back. He examined me, crossing his arms. Then the leaden words came from his lips.
"It is finished."
A terrifying gesture of anger struck my eyes one last time, and I closed them. When I opened my eyes again, I saw my 2 companions motionless, rolled up in their blankets. Were they asleep? For my part, I could not find a moment's repose. Above me was more than 4 miles of Earth's crust. This mass seemed to be leaning with all its weight on my shoulders. I felt crushed, and I wore myself out with violent struggles to turn over on my granite bed. A few hours went by. The deep silence hung around us, the silence of the grave. Nothing reached us through these walls, each of which was at least 5 miles thick. Nevertheless, in the middle of my lethargy, I thought I heard a noise. It was dark in the tunnel. I looked more carefully, and thought I could see the Icelander slipping away with the lamp in his hand. Why was he going? Was Hans leaving us to our fate? My uncle was asleep. I tried to cry out. My voice could not find a way through my dried-up lips. It was now very dark, and the last sounds had just died away. "Hans is leaving us!" I cried. "Hans! Hans!" For an hour, my delirious brain ran through all the conceivable reasons that could have made the calm hunter act in this way. The most absurd ideas intersected in my head. I thought I was about to go mad. But finally, the sound of feet could be heard in the depths of the chasm. Hans was coming back up. An indefinite light began to slide along the rock face, then flowed through the mouth of the corridor. Hans reappeared. He went up to my uncle, put a hand on his shoulder, and gently woke him up. My uncle sat up. "What is it?" "Warten," replied the guide. Well, it must be the case that under the inspiration of extreme suffering, everyone becomes multilingual. I did not know a single word of Danish, and yet I instinctively understood our guide's utterance. "Water! Water!" I shouted, clapping my hands and gesticulating like a lunatic. "Water!" repeated my uncle. "Var?" "Nødat," replied Hans. "Where? Below?" I could understand everything. I had seized hold of the guide's hands and was holding them tight while he looked calmly at me. The preparations for departure didn't take long, and we were soon moving down a corridor whose slope was 1 in 3. An hour later, we had covered about 1.25 miles and gone down about 2,000 feet. At that moment, I distinctly heard an unusual sound running along the side walls of the granite rock face, a sort of muffled rumbling like distant thunder. During the next half hour of walking, not meeting the promised spring, I felt anxiety take hold of me again. But then my uncle told me where the noise was coming from. Hans was not wrong. What you hear is the roaring of fast-flowing water. A stream? There can be no doubt about it. An underground river is flowing around us. Hans looked at me, and I thought I could see a smile playing on his lips. He rose and picked up the lamp. I followed. We went up to the rock face. I watched him. He put his ear to the dry stone and slowly moved it round, listening with great concentration. I understood that he was looking for the precise point where the noise from the stream was loudest. He located this spot on the left-hand wall, 3 feet above the ground. I was highly excited. I didn't dare guess what the guide planned to do, but I had to understand and applaud and embrace him passionately when I saw him lift up the pickaxe to attack the very rock. "Saved!" I cried out. Soon the pick had gone 2 feet into the granite wall. The work lasted over an hour. Suddenly a whistling noise was heard. A jet of water shot out of the rock and hit the opposite face. Hans, almost knocked down by the blow, could not hold back a cry of pain. I understood why when I thrust my hand into the liquid jet, and in turn uttered a wild exclamation. The spring was boiling. "Water! At 100 degrees!" I shouted. "It will soon cool down," replied my uncle. The corridor filled with steam, while a brook formed and headed off into the underground meanders. Soon we were drinking our first mouthfuls. Oh, what ecstasy! What indescribable gratification! What was this water, and where did it come from? I didn't care. It was water, and although still hot, gave back to our hearts the life that was escaping from them. I drank without stopping, without even tasting. It was only after a minute of delight that I shouted, "It's full of iron!" "Excellent for the stomach," replied my uncle, "and full of minerals. Our journey is as good as a trip to Spa or Töplitz." During that and the following day, we covered a great deal of ground horizontally, but relatively little vertically. On Friday evening, the 10th of July, according to our estimates, we were about 70 miles southeast of Reykjavik, and at a depth of just over 6 miles.
Under our feet at this point opened a rather frightening shaft. My uncle couldn't resist clapping his hands when he calculated the steepness of this slope.
"It will take us a very long way," he exclaimed, "and easily, for the projections of rock form a veritable staircase."
The shaft was a narrow slit cut into the mass of the rock, of a sort called faults. It had clearly been produced during the contraction of the earth's very structure, at the period when it was cooling down. If it had formerly served as a way through for the eruptive matters vomited by Schneefels, I couldn't explain to myself how it was that these materials had left no trace. We were going down a sort of spiral staircase that you'd have said was made by human hands. On the 11th and 12th of July, we worked our way round the spirals of the fault, penetrating 5 miles further into the earth's crust, which made nearly 12 miles below sea level. But on the 13th, at about midday, the fault took on a much gentler slope, about 45 degrees, heading towards the southeast. The path became quite easy then and very boring. It would have been hard for it to have been anything else. There was no way that the journey could be varied by changes in the countryside. Finally, on Wednesday the 15th, we were 17 miles below ground, and about 120 miles from Schneefels. Although we were a little tired, our health was still in a reassuring state, and the portable medical kit had not yet been used. 4 days later, on the evening of Saturday the 18th of July, we arrived at a sort of grotto of considerable size. The grotto formed a huge hall. Over its granite floor gently flowed the faithful stream. At such a distance from its source, its water was only the same temperature as the air, and we could drink it without difficulty. On Sunday, after breakfast, the professor wanted to spend a few hours putting his daily notes into order.
"First of all," he said, "I am going to make a few calculations in order to find out exactly what our position is."
He made some notes and then said,
"By my reckoning, we are 210 miles from the base of Schneefels in the southeasterly direction, and according to my previous notes, I estimate the depth reached to be 40 miles.
40 miles, I shouted.
In all probability.
But that's the furthest limit that science has ascribed to the thickness of the Earth's crust.
I will not contradict you.
And here, according to the law of increasing temperature, there should be a temperature of over 1,500 degrees.
Should be, my boy.
And all this granite couldn't remain in a solid state and would be completely melted.
You can see that this is not the case, and that, as usual, the facts are able to contradict the theories.
Uncle, I tried again, I believe that all your calculations are accurate, but allow me to draw a logical conclusion from them.
Go on, my boy, feel free.
At the point where we are now, on the same latitude as Iceland, the radius of the Earth is about 3,935 miles, isn't it?
3,936.
Well, let's say 4,000 as a round figure. Out of a journey of 4,000 miles, we've done 40?
As you say.
And this has been achieved at the expense of 210 miles in a diagonal direction?
Perfectly.
In about 20 days?
In 20 days.
Now, 40 miles is 1/100th of the radius of the Earth. If we continue in this way, we will therefore take 2,000 days, or nearly 5.5 years to get down. The professor did not reply. And that's not counting the fact that if the vertical journey of 40 miles has been at the expense of a horizontal one of 210, that will make 20,000 miles towards the southeast, and we will have come out through a point on the circumference long before we reach the centre.
"The devil take your calculations!" cried my uncle with an angry gesture. "The devil take your hypotheses! What do they rest on? Who can tell you that this corridor does not go straight down to our goal? In any case, I have a precedent on my side. What I am doing here, someone else has already done, and where he succeeded, I will also succeed."
I hope so, but finally I have a right—
"You have a right to keep quiet, Axel, when you attempt to reason in that way."
I envied the perfect indifference of Hans, who, without seeking causes and effects to such an extent, carried blindly on wherever fate took him. For the 2 weeks that followed our last conversation, nothing worth reporting happened. I can only find in my memory a single event of extreme seriousness, but with a reason. It would be difficult for me to forget the smallest detail of it. On the 7th of August, our successive descents had brought us to a depth of 70 miles. In other words, above our heads,
lay 70 miles of rocks, of ocean, of continents, and of towns. We must have been about 500 miles from Iceland. That day the tunnel was following a relatively gentle slope. I was walking ahead. My uncle carried one of the Ruhmkorff lamps, and myself the other one. I was examining the granite strata. Suddenly, turning round, I noticed that I was alone. So, I thought, I have walked too quickly, or else Hans and my uncle have stopped on the way. It's best to join up with them again. Fortunately, the path does not climb very much. I went back the way I had just come. I walked for 1/4 of an hour. I looked. Nobody. I called out. No reply. My voice was lost in the middle of the cavernous echoes that it suddenly awakened. I began to feel worried. A shiver ran through my whole body. "Let's be calm," I said out loud. "I'm certain to be able to find my companions again. There's only a single path. Now I was ahead, let's go back." I went up for half an hour. I listened out to see if some call was not addressed to me. In such a dense atmosphere, it might reach me from a long way away. An extraordinary silence reigned in the immense tunnel. I stopped. I couldn't believe my isolation. I wanted to think that I was just astray, not lost. "Oh, my uncle!" I shouted in a tone of despair. It was the only word of reproach that came from my mouth, for I understood that the unfortunate man must himself be suffering while looking for me. In the midst of that anguish, a new terror came and took hold of my mind. My lamp fell from my hands and broke, and I had no means of repairing it. Its light was getting dimmer, and was just about to give up. Finally, a last gleam trembled in the lamp. I followed it. I breathed it in with my eyes. I concentrated the whole power of my vision on it, as if on the last sensation of light that it would ever be able to see, and then was plunged into the depths of an immense darkness. I lost my head. I raised my arms in front of me, trying to feel my way in the most painful fashion. I started fleeing, rushing at random through this inextricable labyrinth, going down all the time, running through the earth's crust like an inhabitant of the underground vaults, calling, shouting, screaming, soon bruised on the rock projections, falling and getting up covered with blood, trying to drink the blood flooding over my face, but constantly waiting for some wall of rock to come and offer an obstacle for my head to break on. Suddenly the ground disappeared from under my feet. I felt myself rolling and hitting the projections of a vertical gallery, a veritable well. My head bounded against a sharp rock, and I lost consciousness. When I came to, I found myself in semi-darkness, lying on thick covers. My uncle was watching, his eyes fixed intently on my face, looking for any sign of life. At my first sigh, he took hold of my hand. When he saw my eyes were open, he uttered a cry of joy. "He's alive! He's alive!" "Yes," I said in a weak voice. "My dear boy," said my uncle, clasping me to his breast, "you are saved." That moment Hans joined us. He saw my hand in my uncle's, and I ventured to say that his eyes showed a lively satisfaction. "Good dog," he said. "Good day, Hans, good day," I murmured. "And now, uncle, tell me where we are." "Tomorrow, Axel, tomorrow. You're still too weak today. I've bandaged your head with compresses which mustn't be disturbed. Sleep, my boy, sleep. And tomorrow I will tell you everything." "Now, at least tell me what time it is, what day it is." 11 o'clock at night, Sunday the 9th of August, and I forbid you to ask any more questions until the 10th of this month. When I woke up the next morning, I looked around. My berth, composed of all our travelling rugs, was in a charming grotto, adorned with magnificent stalagmites, and with a floor covered in soft sand. There reigned a semi-darkness. No torch, no lamp was lighted, and yet a certain inexplicable light entered from the outside through a narrow opening in the grotto. I also heard a vague and indefinite murmur, like the moaning of waves breaking upon a strand, and occasionally the whistling of the wind. I was puzzling over these insoluble questions when the professor came in. "Good day, Axel," he cried happily. "I am willing to bet you are quite well." "I am indeed," I replied, sitting up. "I thought as much, for you slept calmly. Hans and I have taken turns to watch over you, and we have seen you recovering by leaps and bounds." "I really feel much better now. To prove it, I'll do justice to the breakfast you're going to put in front of me." "Ah, you shall eat, my boy. The fever has left you. Hans has been rubbing your wounds with some sort of ointment known only to Icelanders, and they have closed up marvellously." While speaking, my uncle prepared a few items of food which I devoured. While I was eating, I overwhelmed him with questions. "You say that I am safe and sound?"
"Undoubtedly."
"I have all my limbs intact?"
"Certainly."
"And my head?"
"Your head, apart from one or two bruises, is exactly where it ought to be, on your shoulders."
"Well, I think my mind must have gone."
"Gone?"
"Yes. We haven't returned to the surface of the earth, have we?"
"Most certainly not."
"Then I must be mad, for I can see the light of day. I can hear the wind blowing and the breaking of the sea."
"Oh, is that all?"
asked the professor. "Will you please explain?"
"I will not explain anything, for it is inexplicable. But you shall see, and you will realize that geological science has not yet said its last word."
"Well, let's go out then," I cried, suddenly getting up.
"No, Axel, no. The open air might be bad for you."
"Open air?"
"Yes, the wind is rather strong. I don't want you to put yourself in danger like that."
"But I tell you, I feel wonderful."
"Patience, my boy. A relapse would put us in an awkward position. We have no time to lose, as the crossing could take a long time."
"Crossing?"
"Yes. Have another rest today, and tomorrow we shall set sail."
"Sail?" The word shocked me. "Sail? Did we have a river, a lake, or a sea at our disposal? Was there a ship anchored at some interior port?" My curiosity was aroused to fever pitch. My uncle tried in vain to restrain me. When he realized that my impatience would do me more harm than the fulfillment of my longings, he gave in. I dressed quickly. As an excessive precaution, I wrapped myself in one of the covers and went out of the grotto. At first, I saw nothing. My eyes, no longer used to the light, snapped shut. When I was able to open them again, I stood still, far more stupefied than delighted.
"The sea!" I cried. "Yes, the Lidenbrock Sea, and I like to believe that no other navigator will contest the honor of having discovered it and the right to name it with his own name."
A vast expanse of water, the beginning of a lake or ocean, stretched away out of view. The shoreline, greatly indented, offered the lapping water a fine golden sand, dotted with those small shells that housed the first beings in creation. The waves broke over it with that sonorous murmur peculiar to vast enclosed spaces. It was a real ocean, with the capricious contours of the coastlines of the surface. It was empty, though, and looked horribly wild. If I was able to look so far across this sea, it was because of a special light which revealed the smallest details. It was not the light of day with its dazzling beams and splendid halo of rays, nor the pale indistinct illumination of the night star, which is only a reflection without heat. No, the luminous power of this light, its flickering diffusion, its clear, dry whiteness, the lowness of its temperature, its brilliance, superior indeed to the moon's, all pointed to an electrical origin. It was like an aurora borealis, a continuous cosmic phenomenon, filling this cavern big enough to hold an ocean. The vault suspended above my head, the sky, as it were, seemed to be made of vast clouds, mobile and changeable water vapors which, due to condensation, surely burst into torrential rain on certain days. I would have thought that under such extreme atmospheric pressure, evaporation could not take place. Yet by some physical law which was beyond me, there were great clouds filling the air, but at this moment it was a fine day. The electric layers produced an astonishing play of light amongst the high clouds. Clear shadows stood out on their lower curves, and often, between two separate strata, a ray of remarkable intensity slipped through to us. And yet it was not the sun, for its light gave no heat. The effect was sad, sovereignly melancholy. Instead of a firmament, bright with stars, I felt the granite vault above these clouds weighing down on me. This space, immense as it was, would not have sufficed for the orbit of even the humblest satellite. The word cavern is clearly insufficient for my attempt to convey this immense place. The words which make up human language are inadequate for those who venture into the depths of the earth. It will not be difficult to understand that after being confined in a narrow gallery for 47 days, it was infinite ecstasy to breathe in this breeze loaded with wet and salty emanations. I could not possibly regret leaving my dark grotto. My uncle, already used to these marvels, was no longer astonished.
"Do you feel strong enough to go for a little walk?" he asked.
"Yes, certainly. Nothing would give me greater pleasure."
"Well then, take my arm, Axel, and we'll follow the meanders of the shoreline."
500 paces away, beyond a high promontory, appeared a tall, thick, dense forest. It consisted of trees of medium height, shaped like regular sunshades, with neat and geometric silhouettes. The air currents seemed to have no influence on their foliage, and in the midst of the breezes they stayed as still as a clump of petrified cedars. I hurried forward. I could find no name for these singular varieties. Did they belong to the 200,000 known vegetable species, or would we have to give them a special place in the flora of water-based vegetation? No. When we arrived under their shade, my surprise turned to admiration. I was in the presence of fruits of the earth, but constructed on a gigantic scale. My uncle named them immediately.
"Oh, it's just a forest of mushrooms."
He was right. It may be imagined how big these plants grew in their preferred hot, humid environment. I knew that Lycopodon giganteum reached 8 or 9 feet in circumference, but here we had white mushrooms 30 or 40 feet high, with caps of the same width. There were thousands of them. No light could pierce their dense cover, and complete darkness reigned beneath those domes, crowded together like the round roofs of an African city. After an hour spent in contemplation of this marvellous sight, we set off once more along the path of the Strand to return to the grotto, and it was in the grip of the strangest thoughts that I fell into a deep sleep. I woke up the next day completely cured. I thought a bathe would do me a great deal of good, and so went and plunged for a few minutes in the waters of this Mediterranean Sea. Such a name surely suited this sea better than any other. I returned and lunched with a healthy appetite. Hans knew perfectly how to cook our limited menu, and was equipped with fire and water, so could vary our usual fare a little. With the pudding, he served us cups of coffee, and never had this delicious beverage tasted better.
"Now," said my uncle, "it's time for the tide, and we must not miss the opportunity to study this phenomenon."
What, a tide?
"Of course."
Can the influence of the moon and the sun be felt down here, then?
"Why not? Are not all bodies subject to the force of gravity? This mass of water must therefore be subject to that universal law. So, despite the atmospheric pressure on its surface, you will see it rise like the Atlantic itself."
But where are we, Uncle? For I haven't yet asked you that question, which the instruments must have answered for you.
"Horizontally, 880 miles from Iceland."
As much as that?
"I think I am right to the nearest mile."
"And the compass is still pointing southeast?"
"Yes, with a deviation to the west of 19 degrees 42 minutes, just like on the surface. As to its dip, there is something very peculiar happening, which I have been observing most carefully."
"What's that?" I asked.
"The needle, instead of dipping towards the pole as it does in the northern hemisphere, is pointing upwards instead," said the professor.
I grasped what that meant and said, "That means that the point of magnetic attraction lies somewhere between the surface of the earth and the place we have reached."
"Exactly, and it is quite probable that if we reached the polar regions near the 70th parallel, where Sir James Ross discovered the magnetic pole, we would see the needlepoint stand straight up. Therefore, this mysterious center of attraction is not located at any great depth."
"And that's something that science has never even suspected."
"Science, my boy, is composed of errors, but errors that it is right to make, for they lead step by step to the truth."
With his usual determined air, my uncle announced our next move. We were to sail across the Lidenbrock Sea the next day. I spotted Hans at work on the other side of the promontory which formed the small natural harbour. After a few more steps I was beside him. To my astonishment, a half-finished raft lay on the sand. It was made from timbers of a distinctive wood, and a great number of beams, knees, and frames were strewn over the ground. By the following evening, thanks to Hans's skill, the raft was finished. Once it had been launched, the improvised vessel floated serenely on the waters of the Lidenbrock Sea. On the 13th of August, we woke up early. We were now going to inaugurate this new sort of transport, fast and not too tiring. Hans had fitted a rudder which allowed him to steer the floating construction. He took the helm. I unhitched the mooring line attaching us to the shore. The sail was trimmed, and we set off at a rate of knots. Professor Lidenbrock had given me the job of keeping the ship's log, with instructions to put down even the most trivial observations, to note interesting phenomena, the direction of the wind, our speed, the distance covered, in a word, every incident of our fantastic voyage. I will confine myself, therefore, to reproducing here those daily notes, written as it were at the dictation of events, in order to give a more precise account of our crossing. Friday, 14th of August. Steady breeze from the northwest. Raft progressing with extreme rapidity, going perfectly straight. Coast about 75 miles to leeward. Nothing on the horizon. The intensity of the light never varies. Weather fine, i.e. the clouds are very high, light and fleecy, and surrounded by an atmosphere resembling molten silver. Thermometer 32 degrees centigrade. At midday, Hans ties a hook to the end of the line. He baits it with a morsel of meat and casts it into the sea. He doesn't catch anything for 2 hours. Are there no fish in this sea? Yes, there is a tug on the line. Hans draws it in, and then pulls out a fish which is wriggling furiously. "A fish!" cries my uncle. "A sturgeon!" I shout in turn. "Definitely a small sturgeon!" The professor is examining the animal carefully, and he does not agree with me. This fish has a flattened curving head, and the lower parts of its body are covered with bony plates. Its mouth is wholly without teeth. Quite well-developed pectoral fins are fitted to its tailless body. This animal certainly belongs to the order in which naturalists classify the sturgeon, but it differs from that fish in many fairly basic details. My uncle is not mistaken after all. Following a short examination, he says, "This fish belongs to a family which has been extinct for centuries, and of which only fossil traces remain in the Devonian strata." What? Have we really captured alive an authentic inhabitant of the primitive seas? "We have," said the professor, continuing his observation, "and you may notice that these fossil fish are distinct from any existing species. To hold a living specimen of this order in one's hand is a great joy for a naturalist." But what family does it belong to? To the order of ganoids, family of cephalosphides, genus Pterictis, I swear it is. But this fish displays a peculiarity, which is encountered in the fish of underground waters. Which is? It is blind. Amazing! Not only blind, but absolutely without organs of sight. It now seems very probable that this sea contains only fossil species, in which both fish and reptiles alike are more perfect the longer ago they were created. Saturday, the 15th of August. The sea retains its uniform monotony. No land in sight. The horizon appears a very long way away. Sunday, the 16th of August. Nothing new. Same weather. The wind has a slight tendency to freshen. When I wake up, the first thing I do is observe the intensity of the light. I live in fear that the electric phenomenon might dim and then go out. Nothing of the sort happens. The shadow of the raft is clearly outlined on the surface of the water. This sea is truly infinite. It must be as wide as the Mediterranean, or even the Atlantic. Why not? My uncle tries sounding several times. He ties one of our heaviest picks to the end of a rope and allows it to run out for 200 fathoms. We have great difficulty in pulling our sounding line in again. When the pick has finally been dragged on board, Hans calls my attention to some deep marks on its surface. The piece of iron looks as though it has been firmly gripped between two hard objects. I look at our guide. Tender. I do not understand. I turn to my uncle, who is entirely absorbed in his reflections. I have little wish to disturb him, and come back to the Icelander. He opens and closes his mouth several times, and so conveys his meaning to me. "Teeth!" I cry with stupefaction, examining the iron bar more closely. Yes, the indentations on the metal are marks of teeth. The jaws they adorn must have a prodigious strength. Is some monster of a lost species lurking the deep strata of the waters, hungrier than the dogfish shark, more formidable than the whale? I am unable to detach my eyes from the gnawed bar. Monday, the 17th of August. I take out our firearms and check that they are in a state of readiness. My uncle sees me doing this and nods approvingly. Already, wide disturbances on the surface of the water indicate the troubling of the greatest depths. Danger is near. We must keep a lookout. Tuesday, the 18th of August. Night comes, or rather the hour when sleep closes our eyelids, for there is no night on this ocean, and the implacable light constantly tires our eyes, as if we were navigating in the sunlight on the Arctic seas. Hans is at the helm. During his watch I fall asleep. 2 hours later I am awakened by an awful shock. The raft has been lifted right out of the water with indescribable force and thrown down more than 100 feet away. "What is it?" cries my uncle. "Have we hit?" Hans points at a massive blackish object about a quarter of a mile away which is moving steadily up and down. I look, then cry, "But it's a colossal porpoise!" "Yes, and over there is a sea lizard of a most unusual size. And further on a prodigious crocodile. Look at its huge jaws and its rows of aggressive teeth. Oh, it's disappeared." "A whale! A whale!" shouts the professor. "I can see its enormous tail. Look, it's expelling air and water through its blowholes." 2 liquid columns rise to a considerable height above the waves. We remain surprised, stupefied, horrified at the sight of this herd of sea monsters. They have supernatural dimensions. The smallest of them could crush the raft with a single bite. Hans seizes the helm so as to run before the wind and flee this danger zone. But he notices more enemies on the other side, just as formidable. A turtle about 40 feet across, and a serpent about 30, thrusting an enormous head above the waters. Impossible to flee. These reptiles advance upon us, then move round the raft with a speed that could not be equalled by trains flying at top speed. They swim about it in concentric circles. I pick up my rifle. But what effect could a bullet have on the scales covering the bodies of these animals? We remain speechless with horror. They are now coming at us, the crocodile on one side, the sea serpent on the other. The rest of the marine herd have disappeared. I am about to fire. Hans stops me with a sign. The 2 monsters pass within 100 yards of the raft, then make a rush at each other. Their fury prevents them from seeing us. Wednesday, the 19th of August. Fortunately, the wind blowing with force has allowed us to flee the scene of the struggle. Hans is still at the helm. My uncle, drawn from his absorbing ideas by the incidents of the battle, now retreats again to his impatient contemplation of the sea. Our voyage becomes monotonous and uniform once more, but I have no desire to see it change, if it is at the cost of yesterday's dangers. Thursday, the 20th of August. Light wind, north-northeast variable. Temperature high. We are moving at a rate of 8 knots. At about 12 o'clock, a very distant sound is heard. I make a note here of the fact, without being able to give an explanation for it. It is like a continuous roar.
"Far off," says the professor, "is some rock or small island against which the sea is breaking."
Hans hoists himself to the top of the mast, but does not signal a reef. The ocean is calm as far as the line of the horizon. 3 hours go by. The roaring seems to come from a distant cataract. I make a few observations to calculate the distance covered and note them in my logbook. We are now 1,550 miles from Iceland, and underneath, Britain. Friday, the 21st of August. The weather, if such a term may be used here, is about to change. The atmosphere is gradually being loaded with water vapor, which carries with it the electricity generated when the salt waters evaporate. I feel peculiarly influenced, like all creatures on Earth when a catastrophe is about to happen. The cumuli piled up in the south present a sinister appearance. They have the pitiless look I have often noticed at the beginning of a storm. The air is heavy, the sea calm. At 10 a.m. the symptoms of the storm become more pronounced. The wind seems to soften in order to draw breath again, as if in preparation. The cloud resembles a goatskin bottle inside which terrible storms are accumulating. I do not want to accept the evidence of the sky's menacing signs, and yet I cannot stop myself saying, "It looks as though we're going to have some bad weather." The professor does not answer. He is in an atrocious mood at the sight of the ocean stretching interminably before his eyes. At my words he shrugs his shoulders.
We are going to have a storm, I continue, pointing towards the horizon. These clouds are lowering upon the sea as if to crush it. These words are scarcely out of my mouth than the appearance of the southern horizon is transformed. The accumulated moisture resolves itself into water, and the air, violently sucked in to fill the vacuum produced by the condensation, becomes a raging storm. It comes from the most distant corners of the cavern. The darkness increases. I can only just take a few incomplete notes. The raft rises. It leaps. My uncle is cast down. I drag myself over to him. He is holding onto the end of a rope with all his might, apparently gazing with pleasure at the spectacle of the unchained elements. Hans does not move a muscle. His long hair, pushed down over his motionless face by the tempest, gives him a strange appearance, for the end of each hair is illuminated by a tiny feather-like radiation. His frightening mask is that of an antediluvian man, living at the time of ichthyosauruses and megatheres. The mast still holds. The sail stretches like a bubble about to burst. The raft hurtles on at a velocity that I cannot estimate, but it is still slower than the drops of water displaced below it, which the speed turns into clean, straight lines. Sunday, the 23rd of August. Where are we? Being carried away with immeasurable speed. The night has been awful. The storm is not calming down. We are living in the midst of an uproar, a constant detonation. Our ears are bleeding. We are unable to exchange a single word. The lightning never stops striking. Monday, the 24th of August. Will this terrible storm ever end? Why should this state of hyperdense atmosphere, once it has been modified, not remain as it is indefinitely? We are broken with fatigue. Hans, the same as ever. The raft heads endlessly southeast. Impossible to say a single word to each other for the last 3 days. We open our mouths. We move our lips. No audible sound is produced. Even speaking directly into the ear does not work. My uncle comes close. He pronounces some words. I think he says, "We are lost." I am not certain. I make up my mind and write a few words to him. "Let's take in the sail." He nods to indicate his consent. His head has not had time to resume its original position when a disk of fire appears on the edge of the raft. The mast and the sails are carried off in a single movement, and I see them fly away to a tremendous height. We are frozen with terror. The ball is half white, half electric blue, of the size of a 10-inch bombshell. It moves around leisurely, while turning with an astonishing speed under the lash of the storm. It runs about here and there. It clambers onto one of the crossbeams of the raft, jumps onto the food bag, gives a little leap, then lightly touches our powder keg. Horror. We are about to explode. But no, the blinding disc moves to one side. It goes up to Hans, who stares at it without blinking, then to my uncle, who throws himself on his knees to avoid it. It comes towards me. As I stand pale and shivering in the dazzling heat and light, it pirouettes near my feet, which I try to pull back. I can't. A smell of laughing gas fills the air. It penetrates our throat and lungs. We choke on it. Why can't I move my foot? Is it riveted to the spot? Then I understand. The arrival of the electric globe has magnetized all the iron on board. The instruments, the tools, the firearms are crashing together with a keen jangling noise. The nails in my boot are violently attracted to the plate of iron encrusted in the wood. I can't shift my foot! At last, by a violent effort, I tear my foot away, just as the rotational movements of the ball are about to seize hold of it and drag me away to... Oh, what an intense light! The globe bursts! We are being covered in torrents of flames! Then everything goes out. I just have time to see my uncle lying on the floor, Hans still at the helm, spitting fire under the influence of the electricity. He is saturated with it. Where will we end up? Where? Tuesday, the 25th of August. I have just come out of a very long faint. The storm is still continuing. The lightning is unleashed like a swarm of snakes released into the air. Are we still on the sea? Yes, being carried along with incalculable speed. We have passed under Britain, under the Channel, under France, possibly under the whole of Europe. Here ends what I have called the ship's log, fortunately saved from the shipwreck. I proceed with my narrative as before. What happened when the raft hit the reefs on the shore I cannot say. I felt myself being thrown into the waves, and if I escaped death, if my body was not torn to pieces by the sharp rocks, it was because Hans's strong arm pulled me from the abyss. The fearless Icelander carried me out of the reach of the waves and onto a burning sand, where I found myself lying side by side with my uncle. Then he returned to the rocks, against which the furious waves were beating, in order to save a few stray pieces from the wreckage. I could not speak. I was broken with fear and fatigue. It took me more than an hour to recover. The rain continued to fall, however, a positive deluge, but with that very violence which heralds the end of a storm. Some piled-up rocks gave us protection from the torrents. Hans prepared some food which I was unable to touch. Exhausted by the 3 nights keeping watch, I fell into a disturbing sleep. Next day the weather was magnificent. Sea and sky, as if by agreement, had regained their serenity. Every trace of the storm had disappeared. Cheerful words from the professor greeted me when I woke up. His gaiety was terrible.
"Well, my lad, did you sleep soundly?"
"Perfectly, but every bone in my body aches. I'll be all right."
"I am sure you will be completely all right. A little tired, nothing more."
"You appear very gay this morning," I said.
"Delighted, my boy, delighted. We have arrived."
"At the end of our expedition?"
"No, at the edge of that sea which seemed endless. We will now resume our journey by land and really plunge into the vitals of the earth."
"Uncle, can I ask you a question?"
"Certainly, Axel."
"How are we going to get back?"
"Get back? You are thinking about the return before we have even arrived?"
"Not really. All I want to know is how it will be done."
"In the simplest way possible. Once we have reached the center of our spheroid, either we shall find a new path to climb up to the surface, or we shall quite boringly turn round and go back the way we came. I do not imagine that route will close up behind us."
During breakfast, I asked my uncle if he now knew where we were. "It may be rather difficult to calculate," I added.
"To calculate exactly, yes, even impossible. For I could keep no account of the speed or direction of the craft during these days of the tempest. Still, we can estimate our approximate position."
The professor headed for the rock on which Hans had placed the instruments. As soon as we had reached the rock, my uncle took the compass, laid it flat, and looked at the needle, which oscillated, and then, under the magnetic influence, stopped in a fixed position. My uncle looked, rubbed his eyes, then looked again. Finally he turned to me, flabbergasted. "What's the matter?" He pointed at the instrument. I examined it, and a loud cry of surprise escaped from my lips. The needle marked north where we expected south. It pointed at the shore rather than the high seas. I shook the compass, then examined it again. It was in perfect condition. Whatever position we made the needle take, it returned obstinately to the same surprising direction. There could be no doubt about it. During the tempest there had been a sudden change of wind, one that we had not noticed, and which had brought the raft back to the shores my uncle thought he had left behind forever. It would be altogether impossible for me to give any idea of the feelings that shook the professor. Amazement, incredulity, and finally rage. Never in my life had I seen someone so crestfallen at first, and then so furious. The fatigues of our crossing, the dangers we had passed through, everything had to be started all over again. Instead of making progress, we had gone backwards. But my uncle was on top again very soon.
"Fate plays me such tricks. The elements are conspiring against me. Air, fire, and water are combining to stop me getting through. Well, they are going to see what my willpower can do. I shall not yield. I shall not retreat 1/10 of an inch. We shall see who wins, man or nature."
I judged it sensible to intervene and put some sort of check upon this mad eagerness. "Listen to me," I said in a firm voice. "There must be some limit to every ambition in this world. One must not fight against the impossible. We are ill-equipped for a sea voyage. One cannot cover 1,200 miles on a poor construction of beams, with a blanket for a sail and a stick for a mast, against an unleashed contrary wind. Since we are unable to steer, we will become the playthings of the storm, and it is to act like lunatics to attempt this impossible crossing a second time." I was allowed to go through these irrefutable reasons for about 10 minutes without interruption. But this was only because of the professor's inattention. He did not hear a single word of my arguments.
"To the raft!"
he cried. Such was his response. In vain did I implore him. I lost my temper. I came up against a will harder than granite. Hans was just finishing his repairs to the raft. It was almost as if this strange being had guessed my uncle's projects. The professor said a few words to the guide, who immediately loaded our luggage on board and prepared everything for departure. The atmosphere was now pure, and the northwest wind held steady. What could I do? Resist? 1 against 2? Impossible. If only Hans had supported me, but no! As far as I could see, the Icelander had set aside all volition of his own and taken a vow of self-denial. I could get nothing out of a servant so feudally subjugated to his master. All I could do was not rock the boat. I moved to take my usual place on the raft, but my uncle stopped me with his hand. "We shall only start tomorrow." For the rest of that day, my uncle determined we should explore further inland. We advanced with difficulty over the broken granite, mixed with flint, quartz, and alluvial deposits, when a field, more than a field, a plain of bones appeared before our eyes. It looked like an immense cemetery, where the generations of 2,000 years mingled their eternal dust. Large bulges of remains stretched out in the layered distance. They undulated away to the limits of the horizon, and were lost in an out-of-focus mist. Within that area of perhaps 3 miles was accumulated the whole history of animal life, writ too small in the recent ground of the inhabited world. We were carried forward by an impetuous curiosity. With a dry sound our feet crushed the remains of these prehistoric animals, whose rare and valuable fragments are fought over by the museums of the greatest cities. Suddenly, giving a cry, my uncle, racing across the organic dust, seized a bare skull and screamed in a trembling voice, "Axel! Axel! It's a human head!" It was a perfectly recognizable human body. Had some peculiarity of the soil, as in the Saint-Michel cemetery in Bordeaux, preserved it unchanged down through the centuries? It was difficult to say. But in any case, this body was before our eyes exactly as it had lived, complete with stretched parchment-like skin, limbs still fleshy and soft, apparently at least, teeth still preserved, a considerable head of hair, and finger and toenails of a frightening length. I was dumbstruck at this apparition from another age. My uncle, usually possessed of such a way with words, normally so eager to make speeches about anything, fell silent as well. We propped the body up against a rock. He looked at us from his hollow eye sockets. We drummed on his sonorous chest. After a few moments of silence, my uncle reverted to Herr Professor Otto Lidenbrock, undoubtedly carried away by his personality and forgetting the circumstances of the journey, our immediate surroundings, and the tremendous cavern holding us. He must have thought he was lecturing to his students at the Johanneum, for he adopted a professorial tone and addressed an imaginary audience. "Gentlemen, I have the pleasure of introducing you to a man from the Quaternary era. Some eminent scholars have argued that he does not exist, while others, no less eminent, have maintained that he does. The doubting Thomases of paleontology, if they were here, would be able to touch his body with their hands and thus be forced to admit their error. But to doubt in the present case would be an insult to science. The corpse is there. You can inspect it, touch it. It is not a mere skeleton, it is an entire body, preserved for exclusively anthropological purposes." I was careful not to contradict this assertion. "If I could wash it in a solution of sulfuric acid, I would remove all the earth encrustations and splendid shells attached to it. But the precious solvent is unavailable at present. However, as it stands, this body will recount its own story." Here the professor picked up the fossil corpse and handled it with all the dexterity of a showman at a fair. "As you can see, it is less than 6 feet tall, and we are a long way from the so-called giants. As for the race it belongs to, it is incontestably Caucasian." This fossilized body was not the only one in the enormous ossuary. With each step we took in this dust, we came across other bodies. Suddenly, I stopped short. I held my uncle back. The uniform light made it possible to see the smallest objects in the depths of the thicket. I thought I saw, no, I really did see, enormous shapes wandering around under the trees. They were in fact gigantic animals, a whole herd of mastodons,
No longer fossils, but fully alive, and resembling the ones whose remains were discovered in the bogs of Ohio in 1801. I watched these great elephants, with their trunks swarming about below the trees like a host of serpents. I heard the sound of their great tusks as the ivory tore at the bark of the ancient tree trunks. The branches cracked, and the leaves, torn off in great clumps, disappeared into the monster's massive maws. My uncle stood gazing. Suddenly he seized me by the arm, crying, "Come on, forward, forward!" No, we're unarmed. What could we do amongst these giant quadrupeds? Look, come, Uncle, come on. No human creature can brave the anger of these monsters unscathed.
No human creature? Said my uncle, lowering his voice. You are wrong, Axel. Look over there. It seems to me that I can see a living creature, a being like us, a man.
I looked, shrugging my shoulders, determined to push incredulity to its furthest limits. But struggle as I might, I had to give in to the evidence. There, less than a quarter of a mile away, leaning against the trunk of an enormous kauri tree, was a human being. A Proteus of these underground realms, a new son of Neptune, shepherding that uncountable drove of mastodons. This was no longer the fossil creature whose body we had propped up amongst the bones. This was a giant, able to command these monsters. He was more than 12 feet tall. His head, as big as a buffalo's, was half hidden in the brush of his wild locks, a real mane, like that of the elephants of the first ages. He swung in his hand an enormous bow, an appropriately primeval crook for this shepherd from before the flood. We remained motionless, in a daze, but we might be spotted. We had to retreat. "Run for it!" I shouted, dragging my uncle with me, who for the first time in his life didn't resist. A quarter of an hour later, we were out of sight of this redoubtable foe. And now, when I consider it calmly, now that peace has returned to my mind, now that months have gone by since this strange, this supernatural encounter, what am I to think, what to believe? No, it's just not possible. Our senses must have been mistaken. Our eyes can't have seen what they saw. No human creature lives in that underground world. No race of men populates those deep caverns of the globe unconcerned with the inhabitants of the surface, not communicating with them in any way. It's insane. Deeply insane. We rejoined hands at the raft and set sail again immediately. Finally, after 3 hours' navigation, and having rounded a peninsula, at about 6 p.m., we reached a suitable spot for landing, far away from the dangers of the forest. I sprang ashore, followed by my uncle and the Icelander. This short trip had not calmed me down. I even suggested burning our boats so as to cut off all possibility of retreat. But my uncle disagreed. I found him singularly half-hearted. "At least let's set off without wasting a moment."
"Yes, my boy, but first we should have a look at this new gallery to decide whether we need to get ladders ready."
We were following an almost horizontal path when after only about 20 feet our way forward was blocked by an enormous obstruction. "Blasted rock!" I cried, seeing myself abruptly frustrated by an insuperable obstacle. I sat on the bare ground. My uncle was pacing up and down with great strides.
"Come on," said my uncle. "Using the pickaxes and ice picks, let's force our route. Let's knock down these walls."
"It's too hard for pickaxes."
"An ice pick, then."
"It's too deep for an ice pick."
"But..."
"Well then, the powder! An explosion! Let's mine the obstacle and blow it up!"
"Blow it up?"
"Yes, it's only a bit of rock to break up."
"Hands to work!"
shouted my uncle. The Icelander went back to the raft and soon returned with one of the pickaxes, which he used to hollow out a cavity for the explosive. It was not an easy task. He had to make a hole big enough to hold 50 pounds of gun cotton, whose explosive force is 4 times as great as gunpowder's. I was in an extreme state of excitement. While Hans worked, I devotedly helped my uncle to prepare a long fuse made of damp gunpowder wrapped in a canvas tube. "We'll get through."
"We will get through," repeated my uncle.
At midnight, our work as miners was complete. The gun-cotton charge was crammed in the hole in the rock, and the fuse unwound through the gallery to the outside. A spark was now enough to set off this imposing device.
"Till tomorrow, then,"
said the professor. I had to resign myself to waiting for 6 hours. The following day, Thursday the 27th of August, was an important one in our underground journey. Every time that I think about it now, terror makes my heart beat faster.
From that moment on, our reason, our judgment, our ingenuity were to have no influence at all on events. We were to become the mere playthings of the earth. We were up by 6. Time had come to use the explosives to force a way through the granite crust. I requested the honour of lighting the fuse. Afterwards I would rejoin my companions on the raft. Then we would head out for the open sea so as to reduce the danger from the explosion, which could easily affect an area well beyond the outcrop. According to our calculations, the fuse would burn for 10 minutes before setting off the powder chamber, so I had plenty of time to get back to the raft. But it was not without a certain trepidation that I got ready to play my part. After a hurried breakfast, my uncle and our guide embarked on the raft while I remained on shore. I was equipped with a lighted lantern for setting off the fuse.
"It's time to go, Axel," said my uncle, "but do make sure you come back straight afterwards."
"Oh, don't worry, I'm not going to hang around." I made straight for the mouth. I opened the lantern and picked up the end of the fuse. The professor had his chronometer in his hand.
"Ready?"
he shouted. "Ready!" I pushed the fuse quickly into the flame and it spluttered into life, and I sprinted back to the shore. "Get on," said my uncle, "and we'll head out." With a forceful shove, Hans pushed us off. The raft moved 40 yards out. It was a tense moment. The professor was watching the hand of the chronometer. 5, 4, 3. My heart beat every half second. 2, 1. "Take that, O granite mountains!" What happened next? I don't think I actually heard the noise of the explosion, but the shapes of the rocks suddenly changed before my eyes. They swung away like curtains. I glimpsed an unfathomable void hollowed out from the very shore. The sea, seized with dizziness, had become nothing but one immense wave on whose back the raft rose straight up. The 3 of us were thrown over. Within a second, light had given way to the most utter darkness. Then I felt the solid support disappearing, not beneath my feet, but under the raft itself. I thought for a moment that it was sinking, but soon realized that it couldn't be. I tried to speak to my uncle, but the bellowing of the waters stopped him from hearing me. Despite the darkness, the noise, the surprise, and the excitement, I soon understood what had happened. On the other side of the exploded outcrop was an abyss. The explosion had set off a sort of earthquake in the already shattered ground. A chasm had opened up, and the sea, transformed into a great river, had carried us down into it. I thought we were lost. Suddenly, Hans's calm face appeared. He had managed to light the lantern, and although the flame flickered and almost went out, it threw some rays into the awful blackness. As I thought, the gallery was a wide one, for the light was not strong enough to reveal both walls at the same time. The slope of the water bearing us on was greater than that of the most insurmountable rapids in America. Its surface was as if made up of sheafs of liquid arrows let loose with total power. I cannot describe what I felt with any more precise comparison. When the raft got caught up in the eddies, it was swept on, while turning slowly round. When it went near the walls of the gallery, I shone the lantern on them, and got some idea of our speed from seeing the projections of the rocks as continuous lines, so that we were hemmed in by a network of moving streaks. I estimated our speed to be as much as 55 miles an hour. My uncle and I looked at each other with wild eyes, leaning back on the stump of the mast which had broken in half during the catastrophe. We faced away from the air so as to avoid being suffocated by the speed of the motion that no human force could influence. Words from my uncle finally reached me like a murmur.
"We're going up!"
"What do you mean?" I shouted.
"We're climbing! We're actually climbing!"
I stretched out my arm. I touched the wall. My hand got blood on it. We were rising very fast.
"Exactly as I thought. We are in a narrow shaft only 30 feet wide. When the water reached the bottom of the chasm, it started coming back up, taking us with it."
"Where to?" I asked him.
"I do not know, but we will have to be ready for any eventuality.
I estimate our speed to be 13 feet per second, 780 feet per minute,
or more than 14 miles per hour. At that rate, one can go places."
"Yes, if nothing stops us and if this shaft has a way out. But if it's blocked, if the air gets more and more compressed by the pressure from the water column, we are doomed to be crushed to death." Meanwhile, the temperature was increasing tremendously, and I could feel myself bathing in a burning atmosphere. I could only compare it to the heat given off by the furnaces of a foundry when the metal is pouring out. By degrees, Hans, my uncle, and I had taken off our jackets and waistcoats. The least garment caused us discomfort, even pain. "Are we moving towards a fiery furnace?" I called out at a moment when the heat was getting much worse.
"No," replied my uncle. "Impossible! Impossible!"
"All the same," I said, testing the wall, "it feels burning hot." As I said these words, my hand touched the surface of the water, but I had to draw it back quickly. "The water is boiling!" I shouted. This time the professor replied only with an angry gesture. An invincible terror then took hold of my mind and would not let go. I felt that a catastrophe was soon going to happen, one that the most daring of imaginations could not conceive. An idea that was at first vague and doubtful slowly became a certainty in my mind. I rejected it, but it came obstinately back again and again. I did not dare put it into words, but a number of involuntary observations convinced me. In the flickering light from the torch, I noticed convulsions in the granite strata. A phenomenon was clearly going to happen in which electricity had a role. But this terrible heat, the boiling water... I decided to look at the compass. It had gone mad. The compass, shaken madly around by the electrical phenomena, also helped me to make up my mind. The mineral crust was threatening to break up, the granite masses to come together, the chasm to be plugged, the void filled in, and we, poor molecules, were going to be crushed in the harrowing embrace that resulted.
Uncle, we've had it.
What is this new panic? He answered surprisingly calmly. What is the matter with you?
The matter? Look at the walls moving, this rock which is falling apart, this scorching heat, this boiling water, this thickening steam, this crazy needle, all signs of an impending earthquake.
My uncle gently shook his head. An earthquake?
Yes.
I think, my boy, that you are mistaken.
What, don't you realize that these are symptoms
of an earthquake? No, I am expecting something better than that.
What do you mean?
I'm hoping for an eruption, Axel.
We can't possibly be in the vent of an active volcano, can we?
I think we are, said the professor, smiling. It is the best thing that could have happened to us.
What? I cried. We're in the middle of an eruption. Fate has placed us in the path of red-hot lava, fiery rocks, boiling water, of all the substances that are thrown up in eruptions. We are to be expelled, thrown out, rejected, regurgitated, spat out into the air, in a whirlwind of flame along with huge amounts of rock and showers of ash and scoria. And that's the best thing that could happen to us.
Yes, said the professor, looking at me over the top of his glasses, for it is the only chance we have of getting back to the surface of the earth. Towards 8 in the morning, a new incident happened for the first time. The upward movement stopped all of a sudden, and the raft remained absolutely motionless.
What's happening?
I asked, shaken by this abrupt halt as if the raft had hit something.
Is the eruption stopping?
Ah, said my uncle through clenched teeth. So that's what you are worrying about, my boy. Don't fret. This can only be a temporary lull. It has already lasted 5 minutes, and in a short while we shall be heading towards the mouth of the crater once again.
While speaking, the professor consulted his chronometer, and he was soon proved right in his prediction as well. The raft once more was caught up in a rapid, disorderly flux which lasted for about 2 minutes, then stopped again.
Good, said my uncle, noting the time. It will restart in 10 minutes.
10 minutes?
Yes, we are dealing with a volcano whose eruption is periodic. It lets us breathe when it does.
He was absolutely right. At the allotted time, we were shot upwards again with great speed. We had to cling on to the beams or we would have been thrown off the raft. Then the thrust stopped once more. Since that time, I have often thought about this remarkable phenomenon, but without being able to find a satisfactory explanation for it. Nevertheless, it seems clear to me that we can't have been in the principal chimney of the volcano, but rather a side passage, where there was some sort of counter-effect. How many times the process took place, I cannot say. All I can be certain of is that each time the movement began again, we were hurled forward with increasing force, as if lifted by an actual projectile. During the pauses, we suffocated. When we were moving, the burning air took my breath away. One last time, Hans's face appeared to me in the light from the blaze. My last thought was the horrifying tragedy of the criminal, fastened to the mouth of a cannon, at the moment that the shot goes off, and sends his arms and legs flying into the air. When I opened my eyes again, I felt the strong hand of the guide clutching my belt. With the other he was holding on to my uncle. I was not seriously injured, merely bruised and aching all over. I saw that I was lying on the slope of a mountain, only a few feet away from a precipice which I would have fallen into at the slightest movement. Hans
had clearly saved me from certain death while I was rolling down the flanks of the crater.
"Where are we?"
asked my uncle, who looked highly annoyed at being back on Earth again. The guide shrugged his shoulders as if to show he didn't know. "In Iceland?" I ventured.
"Nay,"
answered Hans.
"What does he mean? No!"
cried the professor. "He must be wrong," I said, getting up. After the many surprises of the journey, another was waiting for us. I expected to see a cone covered with eternal snows, in the midst of the arid deserts of the north, under the pale rays of the polar heavens, beyond the furthest latitudes. But contrary to what I had expected, my uncle, the Icelander, and I were stretched out halfway up a mountain baked by the heat of the sun, scorching us with its rays. The professor found his voice first.
"It certainly doesn't look very much like Iceland."
"Jan Mayen?" I tried.
"Hardly, my boy. This is not a northern volcano with granite peaks and a crown of snow."
"And yet—"
"Just look, Axel. Look!"
Above our heads, not more than 500 feet away, was the crater of the volcano. Every quarter of an hour there came flying from it a tall column of flames mixed with pumice stone, ashes, and lava, together with a deafening explosion. I felt the whole mountain heave every time it breathed, sending out, like a whale, fire and air through its enormous blowholes. Below, on a steep slope, layers of eruptive material could be seen extending 700 or 800 feet down, meaning that the volcano couldn't be more than 2,000 feet high. Its base was hidden by a basket of green trees, amongst which I distinguished olives and fig trees, plus vines laden with purple grapes. It didn't look much like the Arctic, I had to admit. "Where can we be? Where?" I murmured. Hans shut his eyes in indifference, and my uncle stared uncomprehendingly.
"Whatever this mountain is," he said at last, "it is rather hot. The explosions are still continuing, and it would really not be worth coming out of an eruption only to have one's head crushed by a hurtling rock. So let's go down and discover where we stand. Besides, I am dying of hunger and thirst."
The professor was certainly not a contemplative. For my part, I could have stayed hours longer on that spot, forgetting all needs and fatigues, but was obliged to follow my companions down. The slopes of the volcano proved very steep. We slipped into veritable quicksands of ashes, avoiding the lava streams winding down the sides like fiery serpents. After 2 hours' march, a beautiful countryside came into view, completely covered with olive trees, pomegranates, and vines which seemed to belong to no one in particular. Besides, in our beggarly state, we were not inclined to be choosers. What ecstasy we felt pressing these delicious fruits to our lips, and biting whole clusters off the purple vines. Not far off, amongst the grass under the delicious shade of the trees, I found a spring of fresh water. It was bliss to plunge our hands and faces into it. While we were still enjoying a well-earned rest, a child appeared between 2 clumps of olives. "So," I cried, "an inhabitant of this blessed country!" He was a poor little creature, very badly clothed, rather sickly, and apparently much alarmed by our appearance. Indeed, half naked as we were with our untidy beards, we must certainly have presented a bizarre spectacle. Unless this was a country of robbers, we were likely to frighten the natives. Just as the urchin was about to run away, Hans darted after him and brought him back, ignoring the kicks and screams. My uncle began by calming him down as well as he could, and then inquired in good German,
"Wie heißt diesen Berg, mein Freund?"
The child did not answer.
"Good," said my uncle. "We are not in Germany."
Then he asked the same question in English.
"What is the name of this mountain, my little friend?"
Still no answer. I followed the proceedings with great interest.
"Is he dumb?"
cried the professor, who, very proud of his multilingualism, then tried the same question in French. Continuing silence.
"Let's try Italian, then.
Dove siamo?" "Yes, where are we?" I repeated slightly impatiently. The boy said nothing.
"Will you answer?" cried my uncle, who was getting annoyed and shaking the urchin by the ears. "Come si noma questo isola?"
"Stromboli," answered the little shepherd boy, escaping from Hans's grasp and running through the olive trees towards the plain. We weren't bothered about him. Stromboli! What an effect this unforeseen name produced on my mind.
We were in the middle of the Mediterranean, surrounded by that Aeolian archipelago of mythological memory, in that ancient Stronggill where Aeolus held the winds and tempests on a chain. And those rounded blue hills to the east were the mountains of Calabria. And that volcano on the southern horizon was Etna, terrible Etna itself. "Stromboli, Stromboli," I repeated. My uncle accompanied me with words and gestures. We were like a choir singing in unison. Oh, what a journey. What an amazing journey. We had gone in by one volcano and out by another. And this other was nearly 3,000 miles from Snæfell's, from the barren shores of Iceland and the outermost limits of the world. The hazards of our expedition had brought us to the heart of the most fortunate country on the globe. We had exchanged the lands of eternal snow for those of infinite greenery, and the greyish fogs of the freezing wastes above our heads had become the azure skies of Sicily. We have now come to the end of a tale, which many people, however determined to be surprised at nothing, will refuse to believe. But I am armed in advance against human skepticism. The Stromboli fishermen received us with a kindness due to those who have undergone shipwreck. They provided food and clothing. On the 31st of August, after a wait of 48 hours, we were conveyed to Messina, where a few days' rest helped us recover from our fatigue. On Friday, the 4th of September, we boarded the Volturne, one of the French imperial postal packet boats, and landed 3 days later in Marseille. Our minds were submerged in only one problem, that of the wretched compass. This inexplicable fact continued to seriously bother me. On the evening of the 9th of September we arrived in Hamburg. I will not attempt to describe Martha's amazement and Gräuben's joy at our return. "Now that you are a hero, Axel," said my dear fiancée, "you will never need to leave me again." I looked at her. She was weeping and smiling at the same time. I leave to the imagination whether Professor Lidenbrock's homecoming produced a sensation in Hamburg. Thanks to Martha's indiscretions, the news of his departure for the centre of the earth had spread throughout the whole world. People had refused to believe it, and when he returned, they still refused. However, the presence of Hans and a few items of news from Iceland slowly modified public opinion. Eventually, my uncle became a great man, and myself the nephew of a great man, which is not something to be despised. Hamburg gave a civic banquet in our honour. There was a public meeting held at the Johanneum, where the professor told the story of our expedition, omitting only the episodes involving the compass. The same day, he deposited Saknussemm's document in the municipal archives, and expressed his deep regret that circumstances stronger than his will had not allowed him to follow the footsteps of the Icelandic explorer down to the very centre of the earth. He was modest in his glory, and it did his reputation a great deal of good. In spite of the professor's entreaties, Hans decided to leave Hamburg. The man to whom we owed everything would not let us repay our debt. He was suffering from homesickness for Iceland. "Farewell," he said one day, and with this simple goodbye he left for Reykjavik, where he arrived safely. But a worry which might almost be called a torment slipped into this fame. A single fact remained unfathomable, that of the compass. Now for a scientist, an unexplained fact is a mental torture. But heaven intended my uncle to be completely happy. One day, while arranging a collection of minerals in his study, I noticed the much-discussed compass, and began to examine it again. It had been in its corner for 6 months, without suspecting the fuss it was causing. Suddenly, I was flabbergasted. I shouted out. The professor came running in. "What is it? The compass!" "Well? The needle points south, not north." "What are you trying to say?" "See, look, the poles are reversed." "Reversed?" My uncle took a look, did a quick comparison, and then made the whole house shake with a superb aerial leap. What a light shone in his mind and in mine. "So," he cried when he could speak again, "the needle of this accursed compass showed south instead of north. Obviously, then our mistake is explained. But what could have caused this reversal of the poles? Nothing simpler. Explain yourself clearly, my boy." During the storm on the Lidenbrock Sea, the fireball magnetized the iron on the raft and so quite simply disorientated our compass. "Oh!" exclaimed the professor, then bursting out laughing. "So it was all a trick done by electricity." From that day onwards, my uncle was the happiest of scientists. I was the happiest of men, for my pretty Vermont girl, giving up her position as ward, took on responsibilities in the house in Königstrasse as both wife and niece. There is little need to add that her uncle was the illustrious Professor Otto Lidenbrock, a corresponding member of every scientific, geographical, and mineralogical society in the 6 continents.